Welcome to Sleepy Stories. In this episode, we will take a clear and steady look at how democracy began, not as a set of laws or constitutions, but as a natural pattern of human cooperation. The goal is to help you learn while you rest. If you do not fall asleep right away, that is completely fine. In the time you are awake, you will still learn interesting scientific facts before sleep. Simply listen, let your breathing slow, and allow the information to settle at its own pace. Long before the first cities rose from stone, humans depended on one another to survive. Every hunt, every migration, every defense against predators required coordination. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer groups find that decision-making was rarely dictated by a single leader. Instead, choices emerged from murmured consensus. Around the campfire, opinions passed like ripples. A raised eyebrow, a shift in posture, or the brief silence of thought could steer the group as effectively as commands ever could. This pattern of shared judgment appears in our biology. The brain's mirror neuron system allows one person's emotion to echo in another's, enabling empathy and synchronization. When tension spread through a group, cortisol levels rose collectively, urging caution. When relief came, oxytocin promoted trust. Cooperation was not an invention. It was chemistry, learning to harmonize. Modern studies in behavioral ecology show similar principles in animal societies. Flocks, herds, and schools of fish coordinate through distributed sensing, each individual responding to subtle cues rather than central orders. The logic is mathematical. Local feedback creates global order. Early human bands applied that same logic instinctively. Decisions that maximized group survival were reinforced, while selfish or rash acts were punished by exclusion. Over generations, cooperation encoded itself as culture. Archaeological findings from ancient hearths and burial sites reveal patterns consistent with equality. Similar food portions, shared tools, communal care for young and old. These traces suggest that fairness was not an abstract ideal but an adaptive behavior. Sociologists describe this as proto-democracy, a system based on the perception that every voice adds information valuable to the group's success. Language amplified the process. As speech evolved, it turned feelings into arguments and gestures into persuasion. The shift from grunts to grammar multiplied possible viewpoints without fracturing unity. Words allowed correction. One could disagree and still belong. In cognitive terms, democracy began when feedback replaced fear. Neuroscience connects these social beginnings to the reward circuits of the brain. When people act in alignment, dopamine pathways reinforce satisfaction. When excluded, the same neural pain centers that respond to physical injury activate. Fairness thus feels good because evolution tuned emotion to cooperation. Democracy, at its root, is a neurological comfort zone. As night deepens, imagine that ancient circle of light, faces flickering in the fire's glow, voices overlapping in calm discussion of where to go next. No hierarchy, only awareness, moving from one person to another like a shared breath. Out of such moments grew the pattern that later civilizations would call government. The first lesson of democracy is simplicity. Collective intelligence exceeds individual dominance when communication is honest and continuous. The same equations that describe stable ecosystems describe durable societies: feedback, diversity, and adaptation. Humanity learned this not in parliaments, but under stars, where survival required listening more than speaking. And so, the earliest form of governance was neither monarchy nor council, but a living rhythm between minds. It was fragile, improvised, yet profoundly efficient. In every decision reached by many instead of one, lay the seed of something enduring, the belief that truth emerges from participation. That belief still glows, like an ember passed through time, illuminating each new experiment in freedom. In the millennia after the first campfires, human groups grew larger and more permanent. Villages took shape beside rivers, and fields began to replace hunting grounds. When people started living in settled communities, decisions no longer concerned only survival for a day, but the management of shared resources across seasons. Crops, irrigation, and defense required more complex coordination. From this need emerged councils, gatherings where the wisdom of many minds sought harmony. Anthropologists have documented these assemblies on nearly every continent. The Iroquois Confederacy in North America, with its Grand Council of Sachems, functioned through representation and deliberation centuries before the first European parliaments. Each tribe sent voices to speak for their people, and all major decisions required consensus. In Africa, the Tswana Kotla and Somali Shir created open forums where anyone could speak, from elder to youth. In these systems, leadership was a role borrowed, not owned. The chief or elder guided discussion but did not command it. The same pattern appeared in Asia and the Pacific. Polynesian councils ruled through dialogue, and in India, early village panchayats balanced authority through collective reasoning. Such consistency across cultures suggests that democracy is not a Western invention, but a recurring human solution to social complexity. When groups exceed a few dozen individuals, cooperation demands structure, and structure must remain flexible. Councils became that adaptive bridge. Linguistics supports this shared origin. Across unrelated languages, words for speak, agree, and voice appear in governance vocabulary. The very act of uttering a sound became tied to the right to be heard. In many traditions, silence carried equal meaning, a form of assent or dissent depending on context. Communication itself evolved as the first law. From a neurological view, these systems worked because they synchronized attention. When one person speaks and others listen, brainwave patterns can align, a phenomenon known as interbrain coupling. This shared rhythm increases understanding and trust. Councils, knowingly or not, used biology to create social order. Archaeological evidence also reflects this evolution. Circular meeting structures, from stone rings in northern Europe to open plazas in pre-Columbian cities, appear across time. Their geometry symbolizes equality, everyone facing toward a common center. No throne, no elevated seat, only a shared horizon. These spaces were designed for dialogue, not domination. But such harmony always carried tension. When population grew, representation replaced participation. Voices once heard directly now spoke through chosen delegates. It was efficient, but distance introduced risk, the risk that the messenger might forget the message. To balance this, cultures developed rituals of accountability, oaths, ceremonies, and public questioning. In essence, early societies discovered that trust must be renewed, not assumed. The calm persistence of discussion, the willingness to delay action until understanding formed, became a cultural signature of stability. Anthropology calls it deliberative time, the pause before decision that prevents chaos. In that pause lives the same peace you feel before sleep, the mind weighing, comparing, and choosing the right path among many. Today, echoes of these ancient councils survive in every democratic assembly. The seating may be wooden benches or digital screens, but the underlying rhythm remains. Ideas meet resistance, adapt, and merge into compromise. The science of governance and the art of listening continue their dialogue through centuries. In this way, democracy grew quietly before any philosopher named it, in the patient circle of voices willing to listen until agreement found its own shape. The tribe became the first school of citizenship, and every voice, no matter how small, helped tune the harmony that would one day guide nations. By the time the sun rose over the Aegean world of the 5th century before Christ, humanity had already discovered agriculture, trade, and writing. What Athens added to civilization was a new way of thinking about power. Here, in a city of perhaps 40,000 citizens, democracy took a measurable form. The word itself, demokratia, combined demos, the people, and kratos, power or rule. It was the first recorded attempt to translate the cooperation of councils into a systematic method, one that counted not just voices, but votes. The Athenians began with assemblies held on a rocky hill called the Pnyx. Citizens gathered in daylight, open to wind and weather, to decide matters of war, taxation, and justice. Every free man could speak, and the decision would be made by show of hands or by dropping pebbles into urns. The stones were counted in public view, transforming opinion into a visible quantity. power became something that could be measured, a radical departure from hereditary rule. Mathematically, this was astonishing. For the first time, the collective will of thousands was expressed through a single variable, majority. No divine revelation or royal decree could claim greater authority. The process itself created legitimacy, yet the system had boundaries. Women, slaves, and foreigners were excluded. Only adult male citizens could vote. Athens was democratic in method, not yet in inclusion. Still, the experiment redefined what it meant to govern. Philosophers and historians have long noted how this structure mirrored the emerging logic of Greek science. Just as early mathematicians like Pythagoras sought order in numbers, the Athenians sought fairness in arithmetic participation. The link between counting and justice remains today in electoral formulas, probability models, and statistical sampling. Every vote, ancient or modern, is a data point in humanity's ongoing experiment with equality. The ecclesia, or public assembly, functioned as an engine of adaptation. Policies could change rapidly as arguments unfolded, reflecting a dynamic feedback system. The philosopher Heraclitus described reality as constant change. Democracy mirrored that flow. A proposal could be challenged, refined, or overturned without violence, because the mechanism of debate replaced the sword as a tool of power transfer. Within this system, rhetoric emerged as both art and science. The ability to persuade became a civic skill, studied as carefully as geometry. Aristotle would later formalize it, analyzing logic, emotion, and credibility as the three pillars of persuasion. The scientific clarity of this approach, observation, analysis, prediction, paralleled the empirical methods that would shape modern reasoning. Democracy, in its Athenian form, was thus both a political and cognitive revolution. The architecture of Athens reflected these ideals. The open-air theatres, markets, and courtyards served as spaces for discourse. Even the Parthenon, though a temple, embodied symmetry and proportion, the visual language of balance. These aesthetic choices reinforced the psychology of fairness. Citizens walked among structures that reminded them, consciously or not, of harmony and ratio. But the Athenian model also revealed democracy's first paradox. The same system that gave voice to many could silence the few. Popular vote condemned Socrates, whose questions unsettled consensus. The event remains a warning that collective judgment, while powerful, is not infallible. In modern terms, it demonstrates the tension between data and wisdom, between the will of the majority and the integrity of truth. Historians interpret the later fall of Athenian democracy not as failure, but as the inevitable stress test of innovation. It operated without precedent, guided only by civic faith and daily participation. Yet it seeded principles that endure: equality before the law, deliberation as duty, and accountability through transparency. These would later inspire republics from Rome to modern constitutional states. From a neuropsychological perspective, voting satisfies a deep need for agency. Studies show that even simulated choices activate dopamine pathways associated with reward. To cast a vote is to affirm existence, to register a signal in the collective neural network of society. Athens made that biological impulse civic. When we look back across 25 centuries, what seems distant in time feels close in logic. The gestures of those early citizens, raising hands, marking ballots, voicing consent, still echo each time a community decides its course together. Democracy's scientific beauty lies in its repeatability. Under different skies and languages, the same experiment continues, to measure fairness through participation. And so, the story of Athens is not one of perfection, but of prototype. It proved that shared reasoning could replace inherited command, and that the measure of a people lies not in obedience, but in dialogue. Every modern election, in its orderly counting and its quiet tension, carries a trace of that ancient hill where the crowd once lifted its hands to the sky and turned debate into destiny. After Athens demonstrated that citizens could rule themselves, Rome expanded the idea across a vast and complicated world. The Roman Republic, founded in the late 6th century before Christ, was less an imitation of Athens than a calculated adaptation. A city of traders, soldiers, and farmers could not rely on every citizen gathering in one place. Scale demanded a new innovation, representation. Instead of direct votes by all, Rome developed a system where chosen officials acted on behalf of the people. It was a bridge between the intimacy of the polis and the immensity of an empire. At the heart of the Republic were the consuls, tribunes, and the Senate. 2 consuls held executive power for a single year, preventing permanent dominance. The Senate, composed mainly of patricians, guided policy and maintained continuity. The tribunes represented the plebeians, the common citizens, and possessed one of history's most remarkable legal tools, the power of veto, literally meaning, "I forbid." With a single word, they could halt a decision that threatened public interest. This concept, simple yet revolutionary, embodied a scientific principle that still governs systems today: negative feedback. In physics and biology, feedback maintains equilibrium. In governance, it prevents tyranny. Rome's political architecture became a model of checks and balances. Each branch had authority, yet none could act unchecked. Political scientists still describe this as a stable oscillation, forces opposing one another to maintain balance around a central point. The Republic thus functioned not as chaos but as controlled tension, the same logic that keeps bridges standing and ecosystems alive. Roman thinkers approached politics as engineering. Cicero wrote of concordia ordinum, the harmony of orders, where classes cooperate like components in a mechanism. Legal scholars codified this structure into laws such as the 12 Tables, giving citizens predictable rights and duties. The Republic's legalism transformed democracy from a moral aspiration into a rational system, one that could be audited, amended, and scaled. Through written law, power became portable. It could travel beyond the city and govern provinces thousands of kilometers away. Representation solved one challenge but created another: distance between the governed and the governors. To counter that, Rome cultivated ritual transparency. Assemblies met in open spaces, speeches were inscribed, and magistrates swore oaths before witnesses. Public accountability operated like sunlight, sterilizing corruption. Still, over centuries, ambition began to erode restraint. As wealth from conquests concentrated in fewer hands, the delicate feedback system faltered. Senators became patrons, citizens became clients, and loyalty replaced principle. Historians have mapped this decay with precision. When inequality widens, participation declines. When fear of instability rises, citizens trade liberty for order. The Republic's fall under Julius Caesar was not a sudden collapse but a gradual shift in equilibrium, where feedback failed to correct excess. What began as representation became domination dressed in legality. Yet Rome's legacy survived because its engineers of governance had documented every element. Future nations, from Florence to Philadelphia, would study its failures like scientists learning from an experiment that went unstable. The Republic's endurance, nearly 5 centuries, proved that democracy could coexist with expansion, bureaucracy, and even imperfection. Its collapse proved something equally vital: that no system remains democratic without renewal. Modern political theory often traces the concept of separation of powers to Rome's structure. Each generation redefines it through new technologies of oversight, written constitutions, courts, media, or digital transparency. All echo the old Roman insight that power, like heat, must be conducted away before it burns the structure that contains it. Psychologists find a parallel in the human mind. The brain's left and right hemispheres process different kinds of information. Balance between them ensures sound judgment. Similarly, the Republic's design mirrored cognitive equilibrium, emotion tempered by reason, ambition restrained by duty. In both cases, health depends on opposition functioning as dialogue, not conflict. As night deepens in the story of democracy, Rome reminds us that structure can be both protector and prisoner. The laws that preserve freedom can harden into walls if not re-examined. But when balanced with wisdom, representation allows a civilization to think at scale, millions acting through a few, yet remaining in principle the authors of their fate. Democracy's evolution continued beyond the Tiber, But Rome's blueprint endured in spirit, a living model of distributed power, constantly oscillating toward balance, proving that governance, like all living systems, survives only through motion. Every democracy carries within it the same delicate balance that keeps a living organism alive. When the balance shifts too far toward domination, it begins to decay from within. The fall of republics, from Athens to Rome and beyond, follows patterns as recognizable as the biological signs of aging. Historians, economists, and political scientists have all observed the same progression. Inequality widens, trust erodes, and fear begins to override dialogue. Eventually, citizens seek protection instead of participation, and a single voice replaces the many. In the later centuries of the Roman Republic, this process unfolded with almost mathematical inevitability. Conquests had brought immense wealth, but not evenly. The patrician elite grew richer, while small farmers lost their land to vast estates run by slaves. Social mobility slowed, and debt chained citizens to patrons who promised security in exchange for loyalty. Economic models today call this a loss of social elasticity, the point where a society's upward mobility becomes too rigid to absorb stress. Once that happens, tension converts into fracture. Meanwhile, the mechanisms of representation began to corrode. Votes could be bought, magistrates bribed, and elections manipulated by spectacle. The people still gathered, but their choices no longer changed outcomes. Historians compare this to a feedback loop overwhelmed by noise, when information is distorted faster than it can be corrected. The Republic's legal machinery kept spinning, but its signals grew meaningless. The philosopher Polybius, observing these shifts, described a cycle of governance known as anacyclosis. Monarchy gives rise to tyranny, tyranny to aristocracy, aristocracy to oligarchy, and finally, through revolt, to democracy, only for the cycle to begin again. His insight was not fatalistic but scientific. Like natural systems, political structures obey recurring laws. Without maintenance, entropy sets in. By the 1st century before Christ, civic trust had weakened to the point that the Republic's safeguards could no longer restrain ambition. Julius Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon was not merely a military act. It was the physical expression of collective exhaustion. People had grown tired of uncertainty. They desired order, even if it meant surrendering freedom. Neurologically, fear and fatigue both push the human brain toward simplification. Faced with chaos, we prefer one clear command to many uncertain voices. Thus, dictatorship often rises not through force alone, but through relief. Modern data supports these ancient lessons. Studies of democratic backsliding reveal the same predictors across cultures: concentrated wealth, declining voter participation, polarization amplified by propaganda, and erosion of institutional independence. The curve of collapse follows social psychology as much as economics. When shared reality dissolves, identity replaces reasoning. Citizens no longer debate policies, they defend tribes. Yet the fall of republics has always yielded new insight. After Athens came Rome, after Rome came Renaissance city-states, and after them the Enlightenment revolutions. Each failure produced improved models, as if civilization itself were learning through repetition. This evolutionary perspective treats governance like an adaptive algorithm, testing variations and retaining what works. The checks and balances of modern constitutions are not inventions of genius but results of accumulated error correction. In biological terms, democracy dies when its cells stop communicating. When information between citizens and institutions becomes blocked or corrupted, the political body suffers necrosis. Reviving it requires circulation, transparency, education, and dialogue. These act as oxygen to the social organism. History's lesson is therefore not despair but awareness. No system collapses suddenly when its early symptoms are recognized. Philosophically, the decline of republics also teaches humility. No civilization, however advanced, is immune to the forces that once humbled empires. The challenge is not to freeze a perfect structure in time, but to preserve the capacity for self-repair. Just as the human body renews its tissues, societies must continually renew participation, truth, and trust. So, as you let this thought rest, Picture democracy not as a monument, but as a heartbeat. Each generation either strengthens or weakens its rhythm. When that rhythm fades, power seeks stillness in the hands of one. But even then, the memory of the many never disappears. It waits quietly, like an ember, ready to ignite the next experiment in freedom. As the story drifts deeper into the quiet hours of democracy's evolution, it arrives at the world of ideas, the invisible architecture that gives reason to power. You may feel your thoughts slowing as you listen, the way a city grows calm at night. That is completely fine. In this stillness, philosophy begins its work, shaping principles that endure even when the noise of politics fades. The philosophy of democracy did not begin in parliaments or courts, but in contemplation. Ancient thinkers asked why humans seek fairness and what justifies authority. Aristotle analyzed governments as a natural phenomenon, classifying them with the same curiosity he used to study plants and animals. To him, the city-state was an organism, every citizen a cell contributing to the health of the whole. The good life, he wrote, depended on virtue shared among equals. The purpose of politics was not wealth or conquest, but harmony. Centuries later, in the ferment of the 17th century, John Locke described a vision that joined moral logic with natural law. Power, he argued, derives from consent. No ruler has legitimacy unless the governed agree. This was an astonishingly scientific claim. Authority is a measurable relationship, not divine inheritance. Consent could be observed, recorded, and withdrawn. It made government a hypothesis continuously tested by its citizens. Other philosophers refined the concept. Montesquieu studied climates, cultures, and laws as interacting variables, concluding that no single form of government fits all. His analysis prefigured the modern understanding of systems theory, stability depending on proportion and adaptation. Rousseau, in turn, gave democracy its moral heart by writing of the general will, the shared good that transcends individual desire. Although his idealism sometimes led to paradox, his core intuition was psychological. When people deliberate sincerely, their collective judgment can exceed the wisdom of any single mind. This belief later found empirical support. In the 20th century, researchers studying group intelligence discovered that diverse teams often outperform experts working alone, provided communication remains respectful and balanced. The effect depends not on average IQ, but on empathy, the capacity to listen. Thus, even in modern science, democracy's philosophical roots find neurological confirmation. But philosophy also warns of illusion. Plato, witnessing the trial of Socrates, distrusted the crowd. In his Republic, he described democracy as a ship without a captain, drifting wherever desire steers. His skepticism remains a caution. Freedom without discipline collapses into chaos. Yet even his critique strengthened democracy by forcing it to justify itself through reason. Systems improve when challenged, just as muscles strengthen through resistance. While you rest, the mind performs a similar task. It reviews the day's thoughts, sorting what aligns, discarding what conflicts, and integrating what remains true. Sleep, in that sense, is the body's philosophy, a nightly deliberation that restores order. Democracies function the same way. Debates, laws, and reforms are forms of collective dreaming, the mind of society searching for coherence in the noise of experience. The thinkers of the Enlightenment turned that metaphor into method. They argued that knowledge and governance should share the same foundation: evidence, transparency, and dialogue. Truth was no longer a decree but a conversation. Voltaire championed reason against superstition, while Hume explored how emotion guides belief. Their insights turned politics from dogma to experiment. This transition marked democracy's transformation from moral instinct to intellectual discipline. The idea that citizens could reason together, test policies like hypotheses, and correct mistakes through open inquiry linked governance directly to science. Parliaments became laboratories of human behavior. Constitutions became testable models. In the calm of this segment, you can sense the unity between thought and rest. Just as the sleeping mind integrates memories, democratic philosophy integrates generations of reasoning. The conversation never ends, it only deepens with time. When the world seems loud with argument, it helps to remember that debate itself is proof of health. Silence under tyranny is easier, but it means the mind has stopped working. So, as you drift further towards stillness, imagine these philosophers, Aristotle, Locke, Rousseau, Montesquieu, as quiet voices around an ancient fire, speaking of fairness, truth, and the human capacity to share power wisely. Their words echo through the centuries into the world you know now, where every vote, every conversation, and every moment of reflection keeps the grand experiment alive. By the 17th century, Europe stood at the edge of transformation. The printing press had multiplied ideas faster than rulers could suppress them, and the telescope had shifted humanity's gaze from earthbound certainties to a universe governed by discoverable laws. As reason illuminated the cosmos, thinkers began to wonder whether the same rationality could illuminate society itself. Out of this question emerged the Enlightenment, a revolution not of armies but of understanding, and democracy found its modern foundation within that light. The Enlightenment was, above all, an experiment in observation. Natural philosophers like Newton demonstrated that order could arise from measurable principles. His laws of motion described celestial mechanics with the same precision that Galileo's pendulums revealed in timekeeping. These discoveries carried an implicit moral. If nature obeyed rational laws, perhaps human power should too. Arbitrary rule, divine right, and hereditary privilege began to look less like inevitabilities and more like violations of natural order. Coffee houses, salons, and academies became the laboratories of this intellectual movement. In London, Paris, Amsterdam, and Edinburgh, people gathered not to pray or obey, but to debate. The new technology of the age, print, turned speech into networks. Pamphlets crossed borders. Ideas became viral centuries before the word existed. In these circles, liberty ceased to be a poetic ideal and became an applied science, the study of how much freedom a society could sustain before chaos returned. The philosophers of the Enlightenment framed liberty as a system of balance, not license. Montesquieu's spirit of the laws analyzed government like an engineer examining a bridge. Every load required a counterweight. He proposed separating legislative, executive, and judicial powers to prevent structural collapse, an innovation later adopted by the American founders. Locke's notion of life, liberty, and property defined rights as natural conditions, measurable by their universality. Jefferson's pursuit of happiness rephrased this into psychology, liberty as the human drive to flourish. The scientific spirit infused politics with humility. Hypotheses demanded testing, and rulers became subjects of experiment. Early parliaments tried limited suffrage, constitutional monarchies, and public accountability. Results were recorded, analyzed, and debated. Success was replication. Reforms that worked in one region inspired imitation elsewhere. Democracy evolved like a growing data set. This period also birthed the public sphere, the shared mental space where citizens exchange information and form opinion. Newspapers, letters, and discussions became the infrastructure of participation. Jürgen Habermas, a later philosopher, would describe this as the communicative backbone of democracy. In neurological terms, it functioned like the brain's network of synapses, transmitting signals that link individual thought to collective action. Liberty's expansion, however, revealed contradictions. The same nations that praised freedom maintained colonies and slavery. The Enlightenment's logic of equality exposed these hypocrisies, forcing reform through discomfort. The French Revolution would soon test how far abstract rights could withstand human passion. The experiment was violent, but the variables were now defined. Authority must justify itself, reason must be accessible, and knowledge must belong to all. Education became the great equalizer. As literacy spread, people learned to verify claims, challenge superstition, and think critically. Each schoolhouse was a small republic of inquiry, the method of science, observation, hypothesis, experiment, migrated into civic life as the method of democracy, proposal, debate, and vote. Both sought truth through iteration. The Enlightenment also transformed emotion's role. Far from opposing reason, thinkers like Hume and Adam Smith argued that empathy and moral sentiment form the basis of justice. Neuroscience now confirms that moral judgment integrates logic with affective response. Thus, liberty depended not only on intellect but on compassion, an equilibrium between mind and heart that mirrored democracy's balance between freedom and responsibility. As we look back, the Enlightenment appears both ancient and immediate. Its questions persist in every generation that must choose between obedience and curiosity. The light it kindled still glows in classrooms, laboratories, and every public conversation that begins with the phrase, "What if we are wrong?" That humility, the willingness to test even one's own beliefs, is democracy's purest inheritance. The Age of Reason taught humanity that power, like gravity, must obey laws of balance, and that knowledge, once shared, cannot easily be contained. Liberty, measured not in privilege but in participation, became the mechanism through which societies could continuously correct themselves. And in that capacity for correction lies democracy's enduring strength, the freedom to keep learning. By the late 18th century, the world had absorbed the philosophy of liberty, but philosophy alone could not change entrenched systems. To translate ideas into action, people needed the courage to challenge kings, empires, and centuries of hierarchy. What followed were the great democratic revolutions, political experiments that reshaped human civilization as profoundly as the discovery of fire or the splitting of the atom. The American Revolution was the first successful attempt to apply Enlightenment logic to governance. Colonists who had studied Locke, Montesquieu, and Voltaire declared that government existed only by consent. Their Declaration of Independence read like a scientific thesis, hypotheses of human equality tested through revolt. The result was not anarchy but architecture, a constitution balancing powers like a self-regulating system. Each branch of government checked the others, creating stability through measured opposition. It was a political mechanism designed for perpetual motion without collapse. Across the Atlantic, France ignited its own revolution, driven by hunger, inequality, and a fervent belief in reason. The storming of the Bastille in 1789 symbolized more than rebellion. It marked a transfer of legitimacy from monarchy to people. Liberty, equality, fraternity was both a moral and mathematical formula. Freedom as an individual right, equality as a shared constant, and fraternity as the binding variable that kept both in balance. Yet the experiment soon overheated. Without equilibrium, reason gave way to terror, and idealism to tyranny. The guillotine became a reminder that every revolution, like every scientific reaction, requires control of energy lest it consume its creators. Still, the French Revolution's failures taught vital lessons. It exposed the dangers of unchecked passion and the need for stable institutions. Modern democracies would later use these insights to design safeguards, term limits, independent courts, codified rights, to absorb social energy without destruction. Each attempt was an iteration, not an end. Beyond Europe, waves of revolution spread through Latin America, inspired by the same principles. Figures like Simón Bolívar and José de San Martín sought not just independence but representation. They translated the vocabulary of Enlightenment into Spanish and Portuguese realities, proving that democracy could adapt to culture and geography. The spread followed a pattern scientists would recognize as diffusion, ideas moving through networks, accelerated by communication and proximity. Historians sometimes describe the 18th and 19th centuries as an age of political thermodynamics. Energy, in this case social energy, cannot be destroyed, only transformed. Oppression concentrates potential, rebellion releases it. The heat of revolution changes political matter from rigid to fluid, allowing new forms to emerge. The challenge is cooling it into stable institutions before chaos re-solidifies under new rulers. America and France achieved this balance only after years of trial and amendment, much as laboratories refine unstable compounds into usable elements. Printing continued to act as democracy's nervous system. Newspapers reported assemblies, debates, and constitutions with unprecedented speed. creating the first global conversation about governance. The same period saw the rise of political science as an academic discipline. Thinkers like Alexis de Tocqueville treated democracy as a phenomenon to be measured and compared. His observations on America revealed both promise and peril, equality fostering opportunity but also mediocrity, freedom enabling progress but also instability. His conclusion was empirical. Democracy's success depends not on structure alone, but on civic virtue, the internal discipline of its citizens. Revolutions also awakened psychology. People learned that collective will could rewrite history, and that belief itself had material power. Modern neuroscience explains this through the mechanism of social contagion. Ideas spread via mirror neurons, emotions synchronize across crowds, and shared narratives override fear. When thousands chant a single slogan, the brain's boundaries between self and group blur, generating the unity that fuels transformation. From the American assemblies to the French National Convention, one principle survived the turbulence: authority is reversible. No throne, no flag, and no ideology remains sacred when people rediscover their capacity to choose. Democracy thus became not just a system of government, but a state of consciousness, a collective awareness of participation. Every revolution since, from decolonization to civil rights, carries that inheritance. The tools change, the symbols shift, but the underlying law remains the same. When the distance between ruler and ruled grows unbearable, the system resets itself through the energy of the many. Like tectonic plates under pressure, societies fracture, then settle into new alignment. The earth may tremble, but beneath the upheaval lies a deeper constancy, the human insistence on fairness. In the quiet after each storm, institutions rebuild, rights expand, and new generations inherit both the progress and the caution born from fire. Democracy evolves not by design but by resilience, learning to balance power through the same natural laws that govern balance in the universe. Every revolution redefines not just power, but the possibilities of being human. After the revolutions settled, their energy condensed into something quieter, but no less powerful: the written constitution. If rebellion was heat, then a constitution was crystallization, an attempt to give freedom structure without suffocating it. The first modern constitutions, emerging in America and France, transformed ideals into operating systems. They were the blueprints of governance, designed to evolve with time yet maintain coherence, much like DNA in a living organism. A constitution is more than paper. It is a feedback mechanism. It distributes power, defines rights, and creates procedures for its own revision. Scientists would call this self-regulation. When new conditions arise, amendments function like genetic mutations, small adjustments tested for stability. If a mutation strengthens the organism, it survives. If it harms, courts or future revisions remove it. This dynamic equilibrium explains why some constitutions endure for centuries, while others fracture under pressure. The framers of these documents saw law not as static command but as living logic. They built checks and balances into every branch of authority, ensuring no single institution could dominate. The legislative branch proposes, the executive enacts, and the judiciary interprets. A triadic system echoing the balance found in physics and biology. Each force counters the other, maintaining stability through tension. Political theorists often compare this to a gyroscope, always in motion, always returning to center. Language became the code of this new organism. Phrases like "we the people" and "liberty and justice for all" acted as symbolic DNA, simple yet infinitely reproducible. Their brevity gave them strength, their ambiguity allowed adaptation. Over time, interpretation replaced amendment as the main driver of evolution. Judges, scholars, and citizens became the genetic editors of meaning, ensuring that the text could survive new environments, industrialization, globalization, digitization, without losing coherence. Constitutions also formalized the relationship between the individual and the collective. Rights such as free speech, due process, and equal protection transformed moral intuition into measurable principles. Each right could be tested in court, debated in legislatures, and redefined through precedent. This transparency allowed societies to track their own ethical progress. Historians note that constitutional rights tend to expand over time, much like scientific knowledge itself. Once proven useful, they rarely shrink. But the metaphor of living law includes vulnerability. Just as biological systems can suffer infection or decay, constitutions can weaken through neglect. When citizens stop participating, when media fail to inform, when truth loses clarity, the system's immune defenses falter. Demagogues exploit these gaps by redefining words, twisting clauses, and eroding the trust that gives text its meaning. A constitution is only as strong as the collective belief that it matters. In the scientific study of systems, stability depends on redundancy. Multiple overlapping safeguards ensure survival even when one fails. Democracies apply the same logic: independent courts, free press, active civil society. Each acts as a circuit breaker, preventing overload. The United States Bill of Rights, for example, was designed not as decoration but as redundancy, a protective layer against concentrated power. The biological parallel continues in the process of judicial interpretation. Precedent functions like cellular memory, encoding past decisions into the body of law. When similar cases arise, these memories guide consistent responses, yet flexibility remains essential. Too rigid an adherence to precedent stifles adaptation. Too fluid a reinterpretation erases continuity. The art of constitutional governance lies in maintaining this balance, remembering while evolving. In modern times, technology adds a new layer of complexity. Digital surveillance, artificial intelligence, and global communication challenge old definitions of privacy and jurisdiction. Constitutions written for parchment must now interpret data rights and algorithmic accountability. Legal scholars describe this as constitutional metabolism, the rate at which law absorbs and responds to technological change. Democracies with slow metabolism risk paralysis. Those with too rapid adaptation risk instability. Both extremes threaten the organism's health. And yet, across centuries and continents, the pattern persists. Whether written on parchment, codified in digital charters, or living through unwritten conventions like in Britain, constitutions remain the calm heartbeats of free societies. They remind nations that order and liberty are not opposites but partners in balance. When read aloud, a constitution is both a promise and a rhythm, slow, deliberate, and steady, like breathing before rest. It tells every citizen, your rights are part of something living, and your participation keeps it alive. Democracy survives not by perfection but by continuity, through a document that remembers what the people once believed and invites them to believe again. Every democracy depends on one deceptively simple act: casting a vote. At first glance, it seems an act of conscience or belief, a personal choice folded into a box. But beneath the symbolism lies a complex system grounded in mathematics, psychology, and data science. Voting is the mechanism that translates millions of subjective opinions into one collective decision. It is, in effect, the most widespread experiment in statistical inference humanity has ever designed. The logic is precise. When citizens vote, they participate in a large-scale sampling process. The goal is not to capture every thought or feeling, but to measure the dominant direction of the collective will. Statisticians call this the law of large numbers. When enough independent observations are gathered, the average tends to reflect the true mean. Democracy applies that law to society. Each individual decision may be biased or emotional, but together, the aggregation cancels random errors, leaving a signal stronger than any single noise. The design of voting systems reflects this understanding. In simple majoritarian systems, the candidate with more than half the votes wins. Straightforward, but not always fair when multiple parties compete. To correct distortion, other nations adopt proportional representation, runoffs, or ranked choice voting. Each method is an algorithm balancing accuracy, stability, and simplicity. Political scientists analyze them the way engineers compare circuit designs, testing for efficiency, error rates, and failure modes. The process must convert diverse human input into a reliable output, even under stress. Technology amplifies both potential and risk. Ballot boxes once made of wood now exist as digital interfaces. Hand counting has been replaced by optical scanners and cryptographic verification. Computer scientists develop systems where votes can be recorded, anonymized, and verified simultaneously, ensuring transparency without revealing identity. In some democracies, blockchain technology secures the chain of custody for ballots, mirroring the integrity protocols used in financial systems. The aim is to make every vote traceable in its legitimacy, but untraceable in its authorship, a delicate balance between verification and privacy. The mathematics behind vote counting extends into seat distribution and representation. The D'Hondt method, the Saint-Lagu formula, and other allocation systems determine how votes convert to legislative power. Each attempts to minimize wasted votes, those that do not contribute to electing anyone. The fairness of these conversions can be modeled and simulated. Political scientists often run Monte Carlo analyses to predict outcomes under different voting systems. The goal is statistical justice, not perfection, because complete fairness in discrete populations is mathematically impossible. What matters is transparency and predictability, the same principles that define trust in science. Beyond arithmetic, the psychology of voting adds another layer of complexity. Behavioral research shows that choices in the polling booth are rarely made in isolation. They are influenced by group identity, media framing, social norms, and emotional cues. Even the order of candidates on a ballot can affect results, a phenomenon known as position bias. To counter this, modern democracies randomize candidate order or design neutral ballots, subtle acts of behavioral engineering ensuring equal cognitive footing. Another key factor is participation. In statistics, sample size determines accuracy. A democracy with low voter turnout suffers from sampling error. The result reflects not the collective will, but the loudest minority. Sociologists track participation rates as vital signs of civic health. Education, accessibility, and trust all influence whether citizens choose to engage. When people abstain, the data weakens, and governance loses calibration. Voting also carries profound emotional significance. Neuroscientists studying brain activity during elections find that the anticipation of voting activates reward circuits similar to those triggered by music or social approval. The act of marking a ballot reinforces agency, the sense of control that underpins mental well-being. From a psychological standpoint, participation in democracy is both a civic and neurological affirmation. I exist, and I matter in the system that governs me. Errors, too, are treated scientifically. Ballot audits and recounts act like quality control checks. Statistical sampling identifies irregularities. Forensic examination ensures the process remains trustworthy. In this sense, democracy behaves like an open-source experiment. Every citizen a contributor, every election a peer review. Even the waiting period between voting and results follows a familiar scientific rhythm. Hypothesis, data collection, analysis, conclusion. Citizens speculate, observe, and interpret, an emotional version of testing. The result, whether satisfying or disappointing, completes the cycle of legitimacy. What gives the outcome authority is not unanimity but consent to abide by the process. In its quiet precision, voting embodies both science and faith. Science in its methodology, faith in the honesty of the count. It transforms individual uncertainty into collective certainty. Each vote, however small, is a unit of data in humanity's longest-running experiment, the pursuit of fairness through numbers. And though the act lasts only a moment, its mathematics sustain the rhythm of freedom for generations. Democracy depends not only on systems, laws, and data, but on something far more fragile, the human mind making a decision. Every vote, every opinion, every political stance begins inside the neural architecture of the brain. Understanding the psychology of choice reveals why democracies thrive when citizens think clearly, and why they falter when fear, bias, or exhaustion takes hold. Neuroscience shows that decision-making is never purely rational. When a person confronts a question, a policy, a candidate, an idea, two systems within the brain begin their quiet negotiation. The limbic system, ancient and emotional, reacts first. It produces intuitive responses like trust, anger, or empathy. A heartbeat quickens. A feeling of certainty or doubt arises before a single logical argument forms. Only afterward does the prefrontal cortex, seat of analysis and restraint, engage to weigh evidence and simulate consequences. Psychologists call this dual process theory, System 1 for intuition, System 2 for reasoning. In politics, this interplay becomes the hidden machinery of public opinion. Campaigns and media understand these dynamics intuitively. They use colors, music, slogans, and faces to trigger emotional shortcuts. A smile, a flag, or a repeated phrase can activate neural associations so efficiently that critical reasoning feels unnecessary. Behavioral scientists call this affective priming. It works because the brain evolved to conserve energy. Emotion is faster and cheaper than analysis. Democracy, however, requires both: the spark of feeling and the discipline of thought. Cognitive biases further complicate the picture. Confirmation bias drives individuals to seek information that supports their beliefs, while disconfirmation bias makes them dismiss contrary evidence. Anchoring causes first impressions to weigh more heavily than subsequent facts. The availability heuristic makes recent or vivid events seem more representative than they are. Together, these mental shortcuts form an invisible gravitational field around the truth, bending perception toward comfort. Recognizing them is the first defense. Education and media literacy act as corrective forces that flatten distortion. Social influence magnifies these internal biases. The human brain, shaped by millennia of cooperation, is wired to conform. Experiments by Solomon Asch in the 20th century demonstrated how people often align their answers with a group, even when the group is obviously wrong. In the brain, this compliance triggers reward pathways. Belonging feels safe. In democratic societies, that instinct creates both cohesion and danger. Shared norms allow consensus, but blind conformity allows demagogues to manufacture consent. Modern research in political psychology extends these findings to collective behavior. When communities perceive threat, economic insecurity, cultural change, or physical danger, their cognitive bandwidth narrows. The amygdala heightens vigilance, and preference shifts toward authority and simplicity. This is measurable across populations. Fear increases support for strong leadership, even at the expense of liberty. Democracies therefore depend on environments that minimize chronic fear. Stability, accurate information, and trust in institutions keep the public brain calm enough to think. Hope and curiosity, on the other hand, open cognition. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter of exploration, rises when people encounter novelty without danger. Exposure to diverse perspectives triggers neural plasticity, improving empathy and problem-solving. When citizens engage with differing opinions respectfully, the collective intelligence of society increases. Psychologists call this integrative complexity, the ability to hold multiple viewpoints simultaneously. Studies show that high integrative complexity in political discourse predicts long-term stability. In simple terms, democracies survive when their citizens can think in shades, not absolutes. Decision fatigue poses another subtle threat. During long election cycles or information overload, mental energy depletes. The brain, seeking relief, defaults to habitual choices or strong emotional cues. This is why disinformation thrives in noisy environments. Fatigue weakens analysis. Silence, rest, and deliberate reflection restore the mental equilibrium needed for reasoned judgment. In that sense, civic mindfulness is not poetic but practical. A well-rested mind votes better. The act of deciding itself provides psychological reward. Neuroimaging shows that when people make autonomous choices, even trivial ones, brain regions associated with motivation and satisfaction activate. Democracy leverages this biological truth. Participation, signing a petition, attending a meeting, casting a ballot, reinforces the neural pattern of agency. Each act strengthens the emotional bond between citizen and state, transforming governance from abstraction into lived experience. Understanding the psychology of choice does not diminish democracy's moral dignity, it deepens it. Recognizing that humans are emotional, biased, and imperfect allows systems to be designed with compassion. Laws, debates, and education become tools that guide instincts toward wisdom rather than suppression. In the quiet rhythm of thought before sleep, you might sense the same interplay within yourself. Emotion rising, logic responding, both seeking harmony. That balance between feeling and reason mirrors the heartbeat of democracy. When citizens achieve it within, their societies reflect it without. In every mindful decision lies the invisible science of freedom. As the light of day fades from the city square and the crowds return to silence, democracy continues its work, not through speeches or votes, but through reflection. The voice of the people never truly stops, it only softens into thought. And in that quiet, the collective mind begins to rest, to process what it has heard. If your own mind feels the same, drifting towards stillness, thoughts loosening their grip, that is completely fine. The rhythm of rest mirrors the rhythm of deliberation itself. Every society functions like a vast nervous system. Information travels through its media and conversations as signals through neurons. Each citizen, a cell in the social brain, transmits opinions, receives feedback, and adjusts behavior. When these signals synchronize, a shared understanding emerges. But when noise overwhelms signal, confusion spreads. The health of democracy depends on its ability to rest between these bursts of activity, to pause, filter, and recover clarity before the next decision. Sleep research shows that during rest, the brain reorganizes experience. Memories of the day are replayed, sorted, and integrated into long-term networks. Neurons strengthen useful connections and prune redundant ones. Societies perform a similar function through reflection, analyzing data, evaluating policies, and learning from mistakes. The resting state of democracy is the period between elections or debates when citizens digest information, discuss quietly, and allow consensus to reform at a slower pace. History demonstrates how necessary these pauses are. After revolutions or crises, nations often experience exhaustion. When public energy burns too long, coherence breaks down, polarization rises, and dialogue loses meaning. Periods of calm, constitutions drafted, schools rebuilt, conversations normalized, act as sleep cycles for nations. They consolidate collective memory and restore trust. Without such rest, the civic brain becomes insomniac, agitated by constant stimulation, unable to think deeply. Modern society faces precisely that challenge. The digital world never sleeps. News feeds refresh every second. Social media keeps emotions aroused, and algorithms reward reaction over reflection. Psychologists now measure attention fatigue as a societal condition. When minds are constantly provoked, they lose the capacity for empathy and nuance. Democracy begins to resemble a body deprived of sleep, impulsive, irritable, and prone to error. The cure, as in biology, is not silence forever, but cycles of silence, intentional rest built into civic life. Philosophers once wrote of the polis, the city, as a living organism whose soul resided in its citizens' dialogue. Today, that soul expands through networks and screens, yet it still needs stillness to sustain consciousness. Meditation, reading, conversation without agenda, these quiet acts rebuild the neural pathways of reason. Even policy benefits from pauses. Studies show that decision quality improves when committees take breaks, allowing subconscious processing to reveal hidden insights. There is something profoundly democratic about the act of listening, both awake and asleep. It acknowledges that truth may arise from anywhere, that even silence can carry meaning. When citizens listen to each other, to evidence, to conscience, they perform democracy's most essential ritual. And when they rest, their minds unconsciously continue the dialogue, linking values to memories, ideas to feelings, until clarity returns. So, as you rest now, think of yourself as part of that larger process. The debates of humanity continue far beyond the moment you close your eyes, carried forward by countless others reflecting, questioning, and learning. The murmurs of the past, philosophers, reformers, ordinary citizens, blend with today's voices into one continuous hum of awareness. It is the sound of a civilization thinking while it sleeps. In the calm between breaths, democracy dreams of fairness yet to come, of balance restored, of words spoken tomorrow with greater understanding. And just as your mind renews itself in the quiet of night, the collective mind renews in patience and trust, both awaken stronger. The voice of the people, like the rhythm of your breathing now, never disappears. It only rests, waiting to speak again when morning arrives. The power of democracy depends not only on the right to speak, but on the ability to be heard. Between the people and their governments lies a vast and intricate network, the media, which functions as democracy's circulatory system. Through it, information flows, opinions collide, and truth competes with illusion. When that flow is healthy, citizens see the world clearly enough to act wisely. When it becomes clogged or poisoned, societies stumble into confusion. The story of media and democracy begins with the printing press, a machine that multiplied thought faster than any empire could contain it. Gutenberg's invention in the 15th century made literacy contagious. Ideas that once moved by word of mouth now traveled as ink, stable and repeatable. Newspapers, pamphlets and books gave citizens access to the same data that monarchs once hoarded. This democratization of information reshaped the structure of power itself. A well-informed population could now challenge kings and priests, not with swords, but with evidence. By the 18th century, coffeehouses had become Europe's information laboratories. People read and debated daily news, forming the first public sphere. The habit of verification, checking sources, comparing accounts, developed as a civic skill. This culture of scrutiny transformed rumor into journalism. The new profession treated truth like a substance that could be refined, tested, and distributed. In that sense, the press became the first scientific instrument of democracy, an open method for measuring reality. The 19th and 20th centuries added speed and reach. Telegraphs, radios, and later televisions compressed distance and time, allowing leaders to address millions at once. Each innovation expanded inclusion but also risked distortion. Radio gave voice to Roosevelt's fireside reassurances, yet it also amplified demagogues who weaponized emotion. Television brought transparency through images. Citizens could now see wars, debates, and disasters unfold. But it also blurred the line between substance and performance. Politics became visual theater, where tone and presence could outweigh content. Communication theory explains why this balance is so delicate. Every message travels through a channel and encounters noise, the interference that distorts meaning. In technical systems, engineers increase signal strength or reduce noise to maintain clarity. In political systems, journalists and educators perform that role. When censorship, propaganda, or corporate monopolies dominate, the noise grows louder than the signal. The result is informational entropy, a society flooded with data yet starved of understanding. In the digital age, the challenge multiplies. The internet shattered the monopoly of traditional media, giving every individual a global voice. Blogs, podcasts, and social platforms turned audiences into participants. At its best, this interconnectivity fulfills the dream of pure democracy, unfiltered dialogue among equals. But it also dismantled the old gatekeepers that verified facts. Algorithms, designed to maximize attention rather than accuracy, now curate reality for billions. Instead of one public sphere, humanity occupies millions of private echo chambers, each reinforcing its own truth. Psychologists call this phenomenon selective exposure. The brain prefers information that confirms identity, releasing dopamine with every agreeable post or headline. The economics of attention exploits this biology. Outrage spreads faster than nuance because it energizes emotion, and emotion drives clicks. The feedback loop is powerful. Platforms reward engagement, engagement rewards extremity, and extremity fractures consensus. What begins as communication ends as polarization. Yet, the scientific principles of clarity still apply. Media literacy, the ability to evaluate sources, recognize manipulation, and understand bias, acts as the immune system of democracy. When taught early and practiced widely, it restores equilibrium. Public broadcasters, investigative journalists, and independent fact-checkers function as antibodies, isolating infection and re-establishing trust. Some nations now approach information management with scientific precision. They track misinformation as epidemiologists track viruses, identifying vectors, analyzing virality, and applying corrective interventions. Artificial intelligence can detect coordinated disinformation campaigns, much like sensors monitoring pollution. But technology alone cannot replace civic responsibility. Each reader, listener, and viewer becomes a custodian of truth. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned that freedom depends not on persuasion alone, but on the shared commitment to factual reality. When facts lose credibility, persuasion becomes manipulation. The task of the media, then, is not to dictate opinions, but to preserve the conditions under which truth can be discovered. In the calm rhythm of democracy, journalism is its steady pulse, neither too fast with panic nor too slow with indifference. When the pulse falters, the body politic weakens. When it beats with balance, societies thrive. The media cannot make people virtuous, but it can keep them awake, alert to complexity, open to evidence, and aware of the difference between signal and noise. Democracy survives not on silence, but on clarity. Each printed page, each verified story, each moment of honest reporting keeps the collective mind aligned with reality. In that shared awareness, liberty finds its most enduring form, a truth spoken aloud and heard without fear. Information has always been the bloodstream of democracy, but in the modern age, it also became its most delicate vulnerability. The same tools that spread knowledge can just as easily spread deception. Influence, once limited to speeches and pamphlets, now travels at the speed of light, shaped by algorithms and delivered through screens that glow in every home. Understanding how information influences human thought is essential for safeguarding the integrity of democracy, because the battle for freedom increasingly takes place not in parliaments, but in minds. At its simplest, information is data organized into meaning. When shared openly, it strengthens collective intelligence. Societies become more accurate, more adaptable, more resilient. Yet when information is distorted, it behaves like a pathogen, infecting judgment and dividing communities. Scientists studying social systems describe this as informational contagion. False narratives spread through populations following the same mathematical models as epidemics. Their transmission depends not on truth but on emotional resonance. Fear and anger, the most contagious emotions, serve as ideal carriers. The psychology of influence has deep evolutionary roots. Humans evolved in small groups where survival depended on rapid communication of danger. The brain, therefore, privileges alarm over nuance. A message that triggers fear spreads faster and lodges deeper than one that invites reflection. In the digital era, this bias is exploited by design. Social media platforms reward engagement, clicks, shares, reactions, and emotion guarantees engagement. Algorithms act as invisible amplifiers, promoting content that provokes rather than informs. The result is an environment where outrage often outperforms accuracy. Researchers at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology analyzed millions of tweets and found that false stories spread 6 times faster than true ones. The mechanism was not coordination but psychology. Novelty attracts attention. Familiarity breeds indifference. Disinformation thrives because it feels fresh, even when it's false. This creates what sociologists call the attention economy, where truth competes for survival against entertainment and shock. In this market, democratic discourse can easily become collateral damage. Governments and corporations have long understood the power of persuasion. In wartime, propaganda unified nations. In peacetime, advertising fueled consumption. Both use the same principles: repetition, emotional framing, and social proof. The 20th century's pioneers of mass communication, Edward Bernays, Harold Lasswell, and others, treated public opinion as a system that could be engineered. Their work introduced the concept of manufactured consent, where people accept decisions not through coercion, but through careful manipulation of perception. The lesson remains relevant. Influence rarely feels like control when it works well. Yet awareness of manipulation also evolved. After World War II, democratic societies established ethical journalism, fact-checking institutions, and public education to strengthen citizens' defenses. These efforts function like vaccines. Exposure to misinformation in controlled conditions builds immunity. Modern pre-bunking campaigns follow similar logic. Warning people about deceptive tactics before they encounter them reduces their susceptibility later. Psychologists call this inoculation theory. Its success demonstrates that reason can indeed outpace fear when given time to prepare. Artificial intelligence adds both promise and peril. Machine learning models can detect deepfakes, trace the origin of viral content, and map networks of coordinated disinformation. But the same technologies can generate convincing falsehoods at unprecedented scale. The struggle between truth and illusion has therefore become automated, algorithms battling algorithms, each refining its accuracy or deception through feedback loops. What determines the winner is not technology itself, but the transparency of those who use it. Ethics must evolve alongside innovation. Philosophers of information argue that freedom of speech cannot mean freedom from responsibility. Democracies must find equilibrium between openness and accountability, ensuring that the right to speak does not become the right to deceive. Regulation, transparency of algorithms, and digital literacy programs form the triad of modern defense. None is sufficient alone. Together, they recreate the balance once provided by slower communication, time for thought before reaction. Despite its challenges, the information age also offers unprecedented opportunities. Never before have citizens had such access to knowledge, science, and diverse perspectives. Open data, independent research, and real-time global collaboration empower informed participation. The same networks that spread rumors also spread truth, faster, broader, and deeper, when guided by curiosity rather than fear. The task, then, is not to reject technology, but to humanize it, to build systems that reward accuracy, empathy, and reflection. Democracy will always rely on influence, because persuasion is its heartbeat. The goal is not to eliminate it, but to keep it visible, to let sunlight, debate, and evidence reveal where influence flows. In the calm between headlines, when the mind slows enough to think, the distinction becomes clear. Propaganda demands obedience, but information invites understanding. And every act of understanding, however small, restores a measure of freedom to the collective mind. Every democracy rests on a promise that freedom and fairness can coexist. But fairness has a measurable dimension, one that economists can chart as clearly as astronomers track the movement of stars. It is called equality, and its balance with prosperity defines whether democracy endures or erodes. Where wealth and opportunity concentrate too tightly, power follows, and representation begins to deform. Where resources circulate widely, trust strengthens, and participation thrives. The economy, in this sense, is not just about money. It is the material foundation of political health. History shows that inequality is democracy's slowest and most silent destabilizer. In ancient Athens, the widening gap between rich landowners and indebted farmers led to unrest and reforms under Solon. In Rome, vast estates devoured small farms until the Republic cracked under class tension. Modern data tells the same story. Political scientists find that when the top 10% of citizens control more than half of national wealth, voter engagement declines and populism rises. People begin to feel that the system belongs to someone else. Economists describe societies as dynamic systems, seeking equilibrium between productivity and distribution. Too much control stifles innovation. Too little regulation allows exploitation. The science of public policy tries to locate the optimal inequality, a range where ambition remains rewarded but access remains fair. It resembles the balance of homeostasis in biology, where every cell receives enough energy to survive without starving others. Taxes, public services, and welfare systems act as circulatory organs, redistributing resources to keep the social organism alive. The link between income and civic behavior is measurable. Studies by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development show that higher inequality correlates with lower trust in institutions. When people believe the game is rigged, cooperation breaks down. They vote less, protest more, or retreat into cynicism. Neuroscience offers a clue. The hormone oxytocin, which fosters trust, declines in environments perceived as unfair. In economic terms, inequality drains the chemistry of social cohesion. Yet absolute equality can also paralyze a society. Systems that erase difference remove incentive. Democracies therefore walk a narrow path between efficiency and empathy. The Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal described this balance as the moral economy, markets regulated by conscience. A healthy democracy allows competition but prevents domination, just as ecosystems thrive on diversity without allowing any species to monopolize resources. Education remains the most powerful equalizer. Data from UNESCO and the World Bank confirm that literacy and civic awareness correlate strongly with stable democracies. When citizens can analyze information, verify claims, and plan for their futures, they are harder to manipulate. Investment in education multiplies across generations, producing what economists call human capital, the resource that cannot be monopolized. In practical terms, a nation that teaches its children critical thinking strengthens its immune system against tyranny. Economic policy also influences emotional climate. Recessions, inflation, or job insecurity heighten collective anxiety, narrowing political tolerance. Behavioral economists observe that under stress, people become more risk-averse, preferring strong leadership and simple narratives. Prosperity, in contrast, expands cognitive bandwidth. People who feel secure can afford to empathize, to deliberate, to compromise. Stability nourishes rationality. Technology introduces new complexities. Automation, artificial intelligence, and digital monopolies have concentrated wealth in ways unseen since the Industrial Revolution. A few corporations now shape global labor markets and even information flows. Democracies face the challenge of ensuring that technological progress does not hollow out the middle class that sustains civic balance. Some nations experiment with universal basic income, others with progressive taxation of digital profits. All seek a modern version of what ancient reformers understood, that freedom requires not only rights but means. There is also a moral dimension beyond economics. Equality affirms dignity. It tells citizens they are seen. When policies recognize the worth of every person through healthcare, education, or fair wages, they translate ethical principles into daily reality. Sociologists call this procedural justice, the perception that the process is fair, even if outcomes differ. Democracies survive longer when people believe fairness is possible, even in imperfection. As you consider these patterns, notice how the same laws of balance govern both markets and minds. Excess creates instability. Equilibrium restores calm. The circulation of wealth, like the flow of oxygen, keeps the body politic awake, creative, and kind. Economy and equality are not separate from democracy. They are its bloodstream and pulse. When one falters, the other weakens. But when both move in rhythm, opportunity flowing freely, success rewarding effort without erasing compassion, democracy gains endurance. Its promise becomes not a dream of perfection, but a living balance continually renewed by the choices of all who share in it. As evening settles and the mind begins to slow, the story of democracy turns inward, toward one of its most delicate balances, the relationship between leaders and the people who follow them. If your body feels heavier now, if your thoughts begin to drift, that is completely fine. Rest, too, has its leadership, the gentle command of calm over chaos, guiding the mind back toward harmony. Leadership in its truest form is much the same, not control, but coordination, not dominance, but direction. Anthropologists studying early human groups discovered that leadership emerged long before governments did. In hunter-gatherer bands, no one possessed permanent authority. The leader was the person most trusted to interpret the group's needs, the best tracker on the hunt, the calmest voice during conflict, the one whose confidence steadied others. Leadership was situational, earned through competence and empathy, and withdrawn when it failed. In biological terms, it functioned like a neural network, choosing which signal to amplify for coherence. Modern psychology confirms that people naturally seek guidance in uncertainty. The brain's reward circuitry responds to confident behavior because certainty feels safe. Functional MRI studies show that when individuals observe a decisive leader, their amygdala, the brain's center for fear, becomes less active. The sense of safety, even symbolic, quiets anxiety. This response explains why, in times of crisis, societies gravitate toward those who appear calm and clear. It is not always reasoned, it is instinctive, but democratic leadership differs fundamentally from command. It relies on legitimacy, not fear. Political scientists describe it as a contract of trust. Followers grant authority in exchange for accountability. This social contract transforms leadership into a measurable variable. Performance can be observed, compared, and replaced. Unlike the fixed hierarchies of autocracy, democracy operates on feedback. Leaders are both signal and receiver, guiding while listening. When this loop functions, power circulates like information in a healthy brain. History offers countless illustrations. Pericles of Athens governed not by decree but by persuasion, calling citizens partners in deliberation. Abraham Lincoln balanced empathy with resolve, translating moral conviction into collective endurance. Modern democratic leaders often combine strategic reasoning with emotional intelligence, the ability to perceive, interpret, and regulate feelings in themselves and others. Neuroscientists associate this with activity in the prefrontal cortex, where impulse meets reflection. Leadership, then, is not a mystery but a mental coordination of cognition and compassion. There is also a social rhythm to leadership turnover. Democracies refresh authority through elections, imitating biological renewal. Cells in the human body regenerate continuously, preserving the organism by replacing worn elements without altering identity. So too do democracies renew themselves when leaders change while institutions endure. The process of transition, peaceful, procedural, and transparent, is a sign of systemic health. Where power clings, the body politic stagnates. Where it circulates, vitality returns. While you rest, consider how the mind manages its own leadership. The prefrontal regions orchestrate countless impulses from deeper, older parts of the brain. Hunger, fear, ambition, compassion, all send competing signals. The brain's executive function listens, prioritizes, and acts. In a sense, every thought is a small parliament, every decision a vote within your own consciousness. And as in democracy, the healthiest outcomes emerge not from silencing emotions, but from integrating them wisely. Democratic leadership must balance decisiveness with humility. Too much certainty blinds, too much doubt paralyzes. Effective leaders know when to speak and when to listen, when to hold course and when to yield. This capacity, psychologists note, reflects a high degree of self-regulation, an ability to manage one's own emotions under pressure. The calm voice that steadies a nation often begins with the calm breath that steadies a mind. As the world grows more complex, leadership increasingly depends on distributed intelligence. Networks of experts, advisors, and citizens now participate in decision-making through data and dialogue. The single hero has been replaced by systems of collaboration, yet the essential quality remains unchanged. To lead is to synthesize chaos into direction, to help others see pattern where there was noise. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine leadership as a shared state, the mind guiding its thoughts, the people guiding their future. Both thrive in rhythm, both falter in haste. The true leader, like the body's own consciousness, does not dominate its parts but harmonizes them. In that gentle coordination lies the quiet strength of democracy and the peace that lets the collective mind, and your own, rest without fear. Democracy, like any living system, survives through equilibrium. Power flows through it much as energy flows through nature, guided by constraints, redirected by resistance, and stabilized by feedback. When that balance fails, even noble intentions can collapse into chaos or tyranny. The concept of checks and balances is therefore not merely a political theory, it is an application of a universal law. Systems remain stable when their parts correct one another through feedback rather than force. The American founders understood this principle intuitively. Influenced by the physics and biology of their time, they designed a government where no element could act unchecked. The legislature, the executive, and the judiciary each held a share of authority and a means of restraint. The idea was not efficiency, but resilience. Like a complex machine built with safety valves, the Republic could absorb error without exploding. Montesquieu, who first articulated this idea in The Spirit of the Laws, saw it as a safeguard against the natural entropy of power, the tendency of authority to accumulate. In the language of modern science, democracy functions as a cybernetic system. It maintains stability through feedback loops. When citizens express discontent, elections trigger correction. When courts strike down unjust laws, the system recalibrates. These adjustments resemble the thermostat that regulates temperature or the human body maintaining homeostasis. Political scientists often model such mechanisms using systems theory, mapping how inputs, public demand, processes, legislation, and outputs, policy, influence one another. When feedback is delayed or distorted, imbalance grows. When it remains clear and continuous, the system thrives. Transparency is the medium through which feedback travels. Without access to information, citizens cannot evaluate performance or express informed consent. Openness, therefore, is not a luxury but a structural requirement. It allows the data of governance to circulate freely, detecting errors before they metastasize. Freedom of the press, audits, and public debate act as sensors that measure the health of institutions. In the same way that a healthy organism senses pain to prevent injury, a healthy democracy senses dissent to prevent decay. But feedback must also be proportional. Excessive correction, too many conflicting signals, leads to paralysis. Too little allows drift toward autocracy. The balance between responsiveness and stability defines political maturity. Economists recognize the same pattern in markets. Small fluctuations sustain adaptability, but large oscillations cause crisis. In social terms, protest and opposition provide necessary movement. Perpetual revolt, however, prevents rest. The art of democratic governance lies in finding rhythm, not rigidity. Technology has transformed feedback speed. Social media delivers near-instant reaction, compressing deliberation into seconds. Governments now operate under continuous surveillance by their citizens, whose opinions form digital weather systems of approval and outrage. While this accelerates accountability, it also destabilizes patience. Systems built for reflection struggle under the pressure of real-time judgment. The challenge ahead is to integrate rapid feedback without sacrificing deep thought, to design digital mechanisms that listen without trembling. Even biological analogies extend further. The immune system protects the body through constant monitoring and response, distinguishing between self and non-self. Democracies face similar tasks, identifying threats without destroying diversity. When feedback becomes overactive, when suspicion targets everyone, the system attacks itself. This autoimmune response appears as populism or conspiracy, where distrust replaces dialogue. The remedy, as in medicine, is moderation, feedback calibrated by evidence, not emotion. Checks and balances also depend on culture. Laws may define limits, but behavior determines whether they hold. A constitution can specify oversight, yet it is restraint, the unspoken ethic of self-limitation, that keeps power humane. Sociologists describe this as institutional trust, faith that others will play by the rules. When that trust erodes, even perfect design fails. The strength of democracy thus rests not only on its structure but on the character of those within it. In nature, balance never means stillness. It is movement contained within boundaries, a dynamic state of correction and renewal. The same is true of free societies. Their beauty lies not in harmony alone, but in the constant hum of adjustment. Legislatures revising laws, courts interpreting principles, citizens recalibrating priorities. The friction between these parts generates stability, as opposing currents steady a ship. Democracy endures because it listens to data, to conscience, to consequence. Feedback allows it to learn from error instead of collapsing under it. And just as the body finds equilibrium through countless small corrections, so does the state survive through continuous self-awareness. Checks and balances are the quiet engineering of freedom, ensuring that power never grows louder than reason, and that correction, not control, remains the heartbeat of the whole. As night deepens and the noise of the day fades, the mind begins its gentle descent into stillness. That slowing rhythm has its reflection in society too. Democracies, like people, need intervals of rest. They cannot exist in constant motion, shouting, or reform. When the collective energy cools, when arguments soften and citizens retreat from urgency, democracy enters its own form of sleep. If your body feels heavier now, if your breathing steadies, that is completely fine. This is the same rhythm that allows both the brain and the body politic to restore balance after long exertion. Periods of civic rest are easy to misunderstand. From the outside, they may look like apathy, but they are often integration, the quiet consolidation of change. Neuroscientists describe how, during sleep, the brain replays memories, strengthening useful connections and erasing noise. Democracies do the same. After waves of protest, reform, or crisis, institutions settle into a quieter phase. Laws are implemented, data gathered, outcomes assessed. The pulse slows so that healing can occur. This restorative cycle, invisible yet vital, sustains endurance. History offers many examples. After the upheavals of revolution, nations often experience fatigue. The people who once demanded transformation begin to crave stability. The French republics, the post-war democracies of Europe, even modern social movements, all pass through a phase of calm where reflection replaces fervor. Economists call this political cooling. It allows systems to recalibrate resources, redistribute attention, and prepare for the next challenge. Like a resting organism, the nation dreams, consolidating lessons of struggle into new wisdom. But sleep also carries risk. Just as deep rest can turn into dangerous unconsciousness, democratic rest can drift toward disengagement. When citizens mistake comfort for completion, participation fades. Voting rates fall, scrutiny weakens, and power quietly concentrates. Historians refer to these episodes as periods of soft autocracy, when freedoms erode not through violence but neglect. The mind of society nods off, leaving governance to those who remain awake, often the ambitious or the extreme. Psychology helps explain why. Constant vigilance is exhausting. People naturally seek relief, but awareness need not mean agitation. Healthy democracies, like healthy minds, balance focus with renewal. Civic education, free media, and transparent institutions act as circadian rhythms that keep engagement cycling without burnout. They remind citizens when to rest and when to awaken. Rituals such as local elections, national holidays, or public commemorations serve the same function as dreams. They preserve identity through symbolic repetition. Science shows that sleep is not a passive state. During deep rest, the glymphatic system of the brain clears toxins that accumulate from waking metabolism. Democracy, too, requires such cleansing. Periodic audits, reforms, and public inquiries remove the waste of corruption and inefficiency accumulated during more active phases. When those cleansing processes fail, fatigue turns toxic. Citizens begin to distrust everything: institutions, media, even one another. The social brain fogs, unable to distinguish fact from fiction. Technology has made true rest rare. Continuous information exposure keeps societies in a state of low-grade alertness, similar to insomnia. The constant stream of headlines and notifications creates a feedback loop of vigilance, depriving the collective mind of restoration. Yet the solution is not silence but rhythm. Just as meditation restores calm through mindful attention, democracies must cultivate reflective spaces, town halls, libraries, education systems, where thought can unfold without noise. In these quiet places, consensus reforms and the civic imagination resets. Sleep also nurtures creativity. Neuroscientists find that during dreaming, the brain forms novel connections, linking distant ideas into insight. Democracies experience something similar during their quieter periods. Innovation in art, philosophy, and science flourishes when political tension eases. The absence of crisis frees energy for creation. The dreams of the individual become the progress of the collective. If you are drifting now, let that be a reflection of this same truth. Rest is not retreat. It is a phase of renewal, a chance for systems, minds, and nations to rebuild coherence. Tomorrow, consciousness returns, bringing new ideas shaped by unseen processes of the night. And when democracies awaken from their slumber, they do so wiser, tempered, and ready to act again. The rhythm of liberty depends on this alternation: action and pause, expression and silence, day and night. In that gentle pattern lies resilience. For both the individual and the state, rest is not the end of vigilance, but its preservation. As you breathe more slowly, so too does the pulse of democracy, steadying itself for dawn. When we look at democracy across history, it does not appear as a straight line of progress, but as a tide, rising, receding, and rising again. Scholars studying political transitions call these cycles the waves of democracy. Each surge begins with the spread of new ideas or technologies that empower participation, followed by a period of resistance, reform, and renewal. The pattern is measurable, like a climate system of freedom circulating through time. The first great wave began in the late 18th century, when revolutions in America and France demonstrated that self-government was not an abstract dream but a functioning model. Their example inspired constitutional movements in Europe and Latin America. Greece, Belgium, and the young nations of South America wrote their own charters of liberty, each adapting the same logic to local culture. The momentum felt almost biological, one society's success increasing the probability of another's awakening. Political scientists later modeled this diffusion mathematically. The adoption of democracy follows an S-curve, starting slowly, accelerating through imitation, and leveling as saturation occurs. The second major wave followed World War I. The empires of Europe had collapsed, and people demanded new forms of legitimacy. Universal suffrage expanded, parliaments replaced monarchies, and women began to vote. Yet the rise of totalitarian regimes in the 1930 seconds revealed how fragile this expansion was. Economists and psychologists studying that era found that mass unemployment, humiliation, and fear created fertile ground for authoritarianism. Democracy, like any organism, could wither when starved of stability. The third wave, after World War II, was global. The defeat of fascism gave moral and practical authority to democratic governance. Institutions such as the United Nations, NATO, and the European Union emerged to embed cooperation in law. Japan and Germany, rebuilt under democratic principles, proved that freedom could grow even from ruins. The spread of education and mass communication made civic participation a shared expectation. The momentum became self-reinforcing. Countries that traded and communicated with democracies were more likely to become ones. Then came decolonization, a monumental shift in world order. Between the 1950 seconds and 1970 seconds, dozens of nations in Africa and Asia declared independence. Some inherited parliamentary systems, others forged hybrid models that blended indigenous traditions with modern constitutions. The results were uneven. Where literacy and inclusion advanced together, democracy endured. Where inequality, ethnic division, or external interference dominated, progress faltered. The pattern suggested that democracy's success depended not merely on ideals but on the conditions supporting them: education, stability, and trust. A fourth wave arrived at the end of the 20th century. The fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 unleashed a cascade of transitions across Eastern Europe, Latin America, and parts of Asia. Within a decade, the number of democratic states doubled. Scholars likened the phenomenon to network theory. As communication lines multiplied, information about freedom spread faster than censorship could contain it. Satellite television, global trade, and the internet carried both images and aspirations of open societies to billions. Yet, as in nature, every surge creates undertow. In the early 21st century, signs of democratic backsliding appeared. Some nations turned toward populism, others toward digital authoritarianism. The same networks that had carried truth now carried manipulation. The promise of connection gave way to fragmentation. Analysts began to describe this era as an ebb, not necessarily decline but consolidation, a period when institutions must adapt before another rise. Historical data supports optimism. No wave has ever been the last. Behind these oscillations lies a simple constant: the human desire for autonomy. Anthropology, psychology, and evolutionary biology all suggest that cooperation flourishes best when individuals feel agency over their lives. Societies that suppress this instinct must expend continuous energy, maintaining control. Societies that respect it release creativity and trust. Democracy, therefore, persists not because it is perfect, but because it aligns with something deeply wired into our species: the need to participate in our collective fate. Viewed over millennia, the pattern of democratic expansion resembles respiration, inhalation and exhalation, tension and release. Each generation breathes life into the idea anew, adjusting its form to new realities. From the ancient councils of tribes to the digital assemblies of today, the same current flows. Voices seeking to be counted, minds seeking to be heard. The next wave may already be forming in unexpected places, in digital governance experiments, in grassroots climate movements, in transnational collaborations guided by science. Wherever transparency, empathy, and evidence prevail, democracy finds new ground. Like the tide it resembles, it always returns, reshaping the shore but never disappearing. Freedom is one of humanity's most powerful forces, yet also one of its most delicate. It thrives on awareness, participation, and balance, and withers under neglect, fear, or deception. The history of democracy reveals that freedom does not collapse in one loud moment, but fades through quiet corrosion, a right ignored, a truth doubted, a trust broken. The fragility of freedom lies not in its ideals, but in its dependence on human attention. Psychology helps explain why liberty, once achieved, is so easily taken for granted. The brain adapts to normalcy. When peace and stability endure, vigilance declines. People stop noticing the structures that protect them, much as one forgets the steady rhythm of breathing. Behavioral scientists call this habituation, the fading of sensitivity to familiar stimuli. In democracy, habituation manifests as political fatigue, fewer voters, weaker civic engagement, diminished outrage at corruption. The mind grows comfortable, mistaking comfort for safety. Yet freedom, like the body, requires constant exercise. History shows the pattern clearly. Athens drifted into oligarchy after complacency replaced debate. The Roman Republic decayed when power accumulated behind the illusion of continuity. In modern times, democracies have fallen not because citizens rejected liberty, but because they stopped defending it. When public discourse turns cynical, when facts lose value, when disagreement feels futile, the immune system of democracy falters. The collapse often comes disguised as efficiency, the promise that fewer voices mean faster progress. But beneath that promise lies silence. Neuroscience reveals that fear accelerates this process. The amygdala, the brain's alarm center, heightens attention to threat and diminishes trust. Authoritarian movements exploit this mechanism skillfully. By amplifying fear of outsiders, of crime, of change, they activate instinct over reason. People under chronic stress favor strong, simple leadership, even if it erodes their rights. It is a biological trade-off, safety for autonomy. The danger is not emotion itself, but the manipulation of emotion without evidence. Social media, with its constant stream of outrage, intensifies this vulnerability. Algorithms feed anxiety because anxiety drives engagement. The result is a collective hyperarousal, a society perpetually on edge. In this state, nuance dies. People choose sides, not solutions. Freedom survives best in calm environments, where thought outruns impulse and empathy tempers judgment. Without moments of stillness, the democratic mind becomes reactive rather than reflective. Economics plays its role too. When inequality grows, citizens experience freedom unevenly. Those with fewer opportunities perceive liberty as theoretical, while those with abundance guard privilege instead of fairness. The social contract weakens, and politics devolves into resentment. Economists have modeled this as a feedback loop. Inequality erodes trust, eroded trust decreases participation, and reduced participation allows inequality to grow. The process feeds itself until collapse or reform resets the cycle. Education remains the most durable antidote. It trains citizens to recognize manipulation, evaluate sources, and understand history. When people know the signs of democratic decay, they can intervene early, through journalism, protest, or the ballot box. Civic awareness functions like early detection in medicine, prevention rather than cure. But education must also cultivate empathy. Facts alone do not sustain democracy. Compassion makes them meaningful. The ability to imagine another's perspective transforms disagreement into dialogue. Even with all safeguards, freedom's fragility endures because it exists in tension with authority. The two must coexist, each defining the other. Philosopher Isaiah Berlin described this balance as negative liberty, freedom from coercion, and positive liberty, freedom to act with purpose. Too much of the first breeds isolation, too much of the second invites control. Democracies survive when both harmonize, when individuals remain autonomous yet connected. The scientific study of resilience offers a hopeful parallel. In ecosystems, robustness emerges not from rigidity, but from diversity. Forests recover from storms because they contain varied species, each responding differently to stress. Democracies recover for the same reason, through the diversity of voices, opinions, and identities that share responsibility for renewal. The presence of dissent is not a flaw but a safeguard. It disperses pressure across many minds. So as night continues and the world outside quiets, consider how freedom depends on both vigilance and rest. It must be protected without paranoia, cherished without pride, renewed without violence. Every generation inherits not a finished structure, but a fragile equilibrium that must be balanced again and again. Like glass, liberty's strength lies in transparency, clear enough to see through, yet easily cracked if struck too hard. Its preservation requires awareness as gentle as your own breathing now, steady, conscious, never forced. When societies learn to breathe together, in rhythm, in trust, in reason, freedom no longer feels fragile. It becomes what it was meant to be, a shared state of calm strength, awake and alive to its own responsibility. In every era, democracy has adapted to its tools of communication. From parchment to printing press, from radio to the internet, technology has always been both liberator and gatekeeper. Today, as algorithms calculate attention and data flows surpass the speed of thought, transparency has become democracy's newest frontier. The systems that once illuminated truth now also conceal it, and the challenge of this century lies in restoring visibility without sacrificing privacy. Transparency means that citizens can see how decisions are made, that the flow of power is observable, traceable, and accountable. It is the civic equivalent of the scientific method, methods exposed, results open to replication. When governance hides its mechanisms, trust erodes, and rumor fills the void. Political theorists define transparency as a feedback process between authority and public knowledge, the ability for citizens to audit the actions of those who govern them. It transforms information into oxygen, keeping the political body alive. The digital revolution promised total transparency. Data could be shared instantly. Archives could become accessible to all. Platforms emerged where every citizen might become both observer and reporter. For a brief moment, information seemed to democratize itself. Yet the same revolution introduced a paradox. The more data generated, the harder it became to discern truth. Visibility turned blinding. The age of information became an age of overload. Computer scientists describe this problem as signal dilution. In any complex network, too much data without filtration increases entropy. Important information drowns in noise. Democracies, overwhelmed by constant disclosure and leaks, risk mistaking quantity for clarity. Transparency without comprehension breeds confusion, an open window into a storm. To manage this complexity, modern societies rely on digital infrastructure that operates largely unseen. Algorithms ranking content, sensors collecting metadata, artificial intelligence optimizing policies. These systems make decisions faster than any human assembly could, yet they often function as black boxes, opaque even to their creators. Philosophers of technology now speak of the governance gap, a mismatch between democratic oversight and machine-driven authority. When citizens cannot explain the forces shaping their reality, transparency becomes illusion. Some nations attempt to close this gap through open data laws, algorithmic audits, and digital ethics councils. Their goal is to create what technologists call explainability, the capacity for machines to justify their decisions in human terms. This parallels the scientific principle of reproducibility, no claim accepted without demonstration. Transparent algorithms, like transparent institutions, allow error detection and correction. The challenge lies in aligning speed with understanding, to make rapid computation serve slow deliberation. Privacy forms the other side of this balance. Too much transparency can destroy the individual autonomy that democracy seeks to protect. Sociologists compare this to an overexposed ecosystem. When every organism is visible all the time, none can thrive. The philosopher Hannah Arendt warned that the public sphere must coexist with the private, that some spaces of thought and intimacy are necessary for genuine freedom. Digital transparency without boundaries becomes surveillance, replacing trust with control. The science of cryptography offers a way forward. Cryptographic transparency allows verification without exposure. Through encryption, citizens can prove participation in a vote or compliance with law without revealing identity. Blockchain systems, properly designed, can record governmental or corporate actions in tamper-proof ledgers visible to all. These technologies, when governed ethically, preserve the paradoxical harmony of democracy: openness for institutions, privacy for individuals. Culturally, transparency reshapes behavior. Leaders who know their actions are recorded tend to moderate extremes. Public access to budgets, procurement, and legislative debates reduces corruption, as sunlight inhibits bacterial growth. Yet transparency alone cannot ensure virtue. It must be accompanied by interpretation. Data must be translated into stories people can understand. Journalism, once again, becomes the bridge, converting raw numbers into narratives that reveal meaning without distortion. In a broader sense, transparency reflects an ancient human instinct, the need to see in order to trust. Our eyes evolved as survival tools. Clarity meant safety. Societies function on the same principle. When citizens can observe justice, understand governance, and verify information, anxiety diminishes. The mind, like the polity, rests more easily in light than in darkness. Still, complete illumination is impossible. Just as the mind requires dreams to process what reason cannot, societies need mystery to sustain creativity. Transparency should not seek omniscience but balance, enough openness for accountability, enough shadow for reflection. In this evolving relationship between technology and democracy, the task is clear: to build systems as honest as they are intelligent, tools that reveal truth without exploiting curiosity, platforms that connect rather than divide, technologies that empower the citizen, not the algorithm. And when that balance is found, when the code of machines aligns with the conscience of humanity, transparency will cease to feel invasive and instead become what it was always meant to be: light that clarifies without blinding, guiding both people and progress toward understanding. Democracy once lived in the physical spaces where people gathered: town halls, cafes, universities, and parliaments. But in the 21st century, its conversations migrated to digital platforms. Social networks became the new public squares, infinite in reach yet strangely fragmented. They connect billions of people, but they also divide them into clusters of like-minded thought, echo chambers where voices grow louder but not wiser. The architecture of these networks now shapes how citizens perceive truth, identity, and each other. From a technical perspective, social networks are systems of nodes and links, modeled in mathematics as graphs. Each node represents a person, each link a connection. In theory, this structure should promote diversity, information flowing freely between distant clusters. But algorithms designed to maximize engagement change the pattern. They feed users what they prefer, strengthening familiar connections and weakening exposure to difference. The result is network homophily, the tendency of similar nodes to cluster. Over time, information circulates within bubbles instead of across them. Psychologists explain why this feels comforting. The brain rewards familiarity. When we read opinions that align with our beliefs, dopamine releases, producing satisfaction. This neural pleasure loop reinforces confirmation bias, the cognitive shortcut that favors agreement over accuracy. In social terms, echo chambers function like emotional ecosystems, stable but sterile, safe but stifling. Citizens who dwell too long within them begin to perceive outsiders as threats rather than participants in dialogue. This dynamic reshapes political communication. Debates that once sought persuasion now pursue dominance. The architecture of social media, likes, shares, and retweets, turns discourse into competition. Each statement becomes performance, each opinion a brand. Sociologists describe this as the gamification of politics. In such environments, nuance loses traction. Complex issues compress into slogans. The public sphere, once a marketplace of ideas, starts to resemble a coliseum of attention. Researchers have visualized these effects using computational models. On platforms where algorithms prioritize engagement, misinformation spreads faster than corrections. Falsehoods thrive because they provoke stronger emotions, outrage, fear, or moral disgust, and the network amplifies emotion regardless of accuracy. The process resembles positive feedback in physics, an echo reinforcing itself until it destabilizes the system. Democracies built on dialogue struggle to survive in conditions of permanent noise. Yet the same technologies hold immense potential. Networks can connect individuals across geography, class, and ideology. They can mobilize solidarity, expose injustice, and coordinate change with unprecedented speed. Movements for climate action, social justice, and humanitarian aid have grown through hashtags and digital communities. The same tools that polarize can also unite, but only when designed and used with intention. The challenge is architectural: to build platforms that value comprehension over attention, empathy over excitement. Solutions begin with understanding the system itself. In ecology, diversity prevents collapse. In networks, diversity of connection restores balance. When people encounter opposing views respectfully, their brains engage more analytical regions, increasing tolerance and understanding. Educators and technologists now experiment with deliberative platforms, digital spaces engineered for slow conversation, where anonymity decreases and empathy increases. The design principle echoes neuroscience. Slow processing leads to deeper insight. Regulation and transparency also matter. Requiring platforms to disclose how algorithms rank and filter content introduces accountability. Some nations propose algorithmic audits, ensuring that recommendation systems align with public interest rather than profit. Artificial intelligence, once the cause of bias, may become its cure if trained to detect polarization and introduce corrective variety into users' feeds. In this way, technology might recover its democratic promise to connect rather than divide. But no system alone can replace human curiosity. The antidote to echo chambers remains the same as in every age: deliberate exposure to difference, reading across perspectives, engaging in calm debate, listening more than speaking. These acts rewire the mind's circuitry for empathy. Cognitive flexibility, like any muscle, strengthens through use. The science of networks teaches that resilience comes from cross-links, bridges between clusters that carry information both ways. In personal terms, each conversation that crosses boundaries functions as one of those bridges. Every time someone pauses before reacting, asks instead of accuses, listens instead of replies, democracy grows slightly more coherent. The map of polarization gains another line of connection. As we navigate these digital landscapes, the goal is not to eliminate echo chambers entirely. Some familiarity is comforting, even necessary. But equilibrium demands permeability. Walls that allow sound to pass, light to enter, understanding to circulate. In that porousness, democracy breathes again. If you imagine society as a network of minds, then clarity depends on connection, not consensus. The healthiest systems are those where ideas flow freely enough to challenge, yet gently enough to teach. And when that rhythm returns, between signal and echo, between noise and reflection, the digital age may yet rediscover what the ancient assembly once knew, that the strength of a people lies not in unison, but in conversation. Democracy begins in the classroom long before it reaches the voting booth. The ability to question, reason, and empathize, these are the quiet skills that sustain freedom more effectively than any law. Civic education is therefore not just a curriculum about institutions and history, it is the scientific training of judgment itself. When citizens learn how to think rather than what to think, democracy gains an immune system strong enough to resist manipulation. Education has always been political, in the broadest sense of the word, not partisan, but formative. In Athens, young citizens were taught rhetoric, ethics, and logic, the cognitive tools of participation. In Enlightenment Europe, the spread of literacy multiplied the number of people capable of evaluating authority. Today, in an age of algorithms and misinformation, critical thinking functions as both compass and shield. It directs curiosity toward evidence and defends perception from distortion. Neuroscience reveals that learning literally reshapes the brain. When students engage in analysis, debate, or problem-solving, neural connections strengthen across the prefrontal cortex, the region responsible for planning, reasoning, and self-regulation. These same circuits underlie democratic behavior, patience, empathy, and the ability to delay gratification for long-term reward. In that sense, classrooms mirror parliaments. Both are environments where ideas compete peacefully under shared rules. Civic education, at its best, teaches three literacies. The first is informational, understanding how to verify claims, trace sources, and recognize bias. Students learn to ask, "How do we know?" before they ask, "What do we believe?" The second is emotional, understanding how feelings influence judgment. Emotional literacy transforms disagreement from threat into dialogue. The third is ethical, recognizing that freedom carries responsibility, that the right to speak includes the duty to listen. Together, these literacies form the architecture of citizenship. Empirical studies confirm their impact. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development's research on education shows that nations with strong civic curricula report higher voter turnout, lower corruption, and greater trust in institutions. Political tolerance correlates with exposure to critical discussion in schools. When students simulate debates, negotiate group projects, or analyze conflicting sources, they practice democracy in miniature. By adulthood, these habits of mind extend to the public sphere. Technology now expands both opportunity and challenge. Online learning provides unprecedented access to information, but also floods students with unverified content. The skill of discernment, knowing which data deserves attention, becomes as essential as literacy itself. Educators experiment with digital hygiene, teaching students to pause before sharing, to check multiple sources, and to distinguish peer review from viral rumor. These lessons may seem mundane, yet they are the modern equivalent of teaching citizens how to vote wisely in the marketplace of ideas. Critical thinking also depends on diversity of perspective. Studies in cognitive science demonstrate that exposure to differing viewpoints increases neural complexity. The brain becomes better at integrating conflicting evidence. Classrooms that include multiple backgrounds and experiences therefore act as laboratories for empathy. Students learn that truth can have facets, and that listening is a method of discovery. This tolerance for ambiguity prepares them to navigate the uncertainties of democratic life, where certainty is rare and compromise essential. But education must extend beyond schools. Lifelong learning, through media, libraries, or community forums, sustains democracy's flexibility. When adults continue to question, verify, and adapt, societies remain resilient. In contrast, when knowledge ossifies, so does governance. Public investment in education is thus not a cultural luxury, it is structural maintenance, ensuring that future generations inherit a functioning system of thought as well as of law. Philosophers from Dewey to Freire understood this connection deeply. They argued that democracy is a pedagogy, a way of living that teaches itself through participation. Every conversation, every vote, every peaceful disagreement is a lesson in shared reasoning. The classroom, then, is not confined by walls, but extends into the entire civic landscape. The mind trained to think critically does more than resist propaganda. It recognizes complexity without despair. It accepts that evidence can change conclusions and that truth, while sometimes uncertain, is still worth pursuing. These habits give democracy its steady pulse, a collective intelligence that grows more accurate through reflection. As citizens cultivate these mental disciplines, they contribute to the same process that keeps democracies alive, continuous correction through awareness. Just as science refines its theories with each experiment, societies refine their values with each generation of learners. And so, the act of learning becomes the act of preserving liberty. Each lesson, each question, each small moment of doubt strengthens the whole. Democracy's future is written not only in constitutions but in classrooms, where young minds practice the calm courage of thinking for themselves. As the pace of the day slows and your own thoughts begin to soften, the story of democracy reaches its quiet mirror, the resting mind of the polis. Every society, like every individual, needs intervals of silence to make sense of what it has learned. The public mind cannot remain in constant debate, just as the brain cannot remain forever awake. Reflection, pause, and rest are not luxuries of governance, they are necessities of understanding. If you find yourself breathing more deeply now, that is completely fine. You are participating in the same rhythm that sustains civilizations, the calm between decisions, the stillness that gives meaning to motion. The ancient Greeks believed the polis was not merely a collection of buildings or citizens, but a living soul. Festivals, rituals, and public gatherings were its pulse. Contemplation was its rest. Between wars and assemblies, they held periods of silence and reflection, a civic form of dreaming. In those intervals, art, philosophy, and music flourished. The citizens, momentarily free from political urgency, reconnected with purpose. This rhythm, alternating between activity and repose, preserved their sense of belonging. Modern democracies follow similar cycles. After elections, reforms, or crises, societies enter phases of introspection. Committees analyze outcomes, citizens debate quietly in homes and cafes, and governments measure the consequences of policy. This collective pause resembles the brain's consolidation of memory during sleep. Neuroscientists have shown that the mind replays patterns of experience at night, strengthening some connections and pruning others. Societies do the same, reinforcing ideas that worked, releasing those that failed, and preparing for new learning. In both cases, rest is not idleness but integration. It allows chaos to settle into coherence. When individuals sleep, electrical activity in the brain does not cease. It changes form, moving from rapid conscious waves to slow synchronized rhythms. Similarly, when democracies rest, their energy shifts from action to reflection, from campaigning to evaluating, from debate to understanding. Committees, libraries, schools, and cultural institutions become the dreaming architecture of the state, quietly processing its collective experience. Periods of civic rest also foster empathy. Without the adrenaline of conflict, citizens regain perspective. Sociologists observe that tolerance increases in stable times, because emotional energy can be redirected from survival to creativity. Art, literature, and scientific discovery often blossom after political calm, as if societies, like minds, awaken from dreams with new insight. But the resting mind of the polis can also be disrupted. When constant stimulation replaces reflection, when headlines never stop, when noise outpaces thought, societies lose their depth. The modern world faces precisely this challenge. Technology keeps every citizen perpetually connected, but rarely reflective. Notifications replace contemplation, immediacy substitutes for meaning. Democracies begin to resemble sleepless minds, alert, reactive, and exhausted. The remedy lies not in withdrawal but in rhythm. Collective rest must be intentional, built into the calendar through education, art, and shared ritual. National days of remembrance, cultural festivals, and even quiet Sundays serve a neurological function for the state. They synchronize emotion, allowing people to feel together before thinking separately again. Political scientists describe this as social homeostasis, the balancing of emotion across a population to sustain cooperation. When you rest, you practice that same homeostasis. Your breathing slows, your heartbeat stabilizes, your mind filters noise from signal. Imagine a city at night viewed from above, its lights dimming street by street, its hum softening into sleep. Somewhere, a late worker finishes the day. Elsewhere, a child drifts into dreams. Together they form the sleeping mind of a civilization, countless consciousnesses, each resting, yet still linked by the invisible network of belonging. This calm is not absence. Within it, potential gathers. Tomorrow, decisions will return, votes will be cast, arguments renewed. But tonight, the polis restores itself through quiet trust, the belief that even in stillness, it remains whole. Just as the mind does not vanish in sleep but reorganizes itself, democracy does not fade when citizens rest, it recharges. So, as you let your body sink deeper into the quiet, remember that rest is participation too, a subtle act of faith in continuity. The world breathes with you. Its systems, thoughts, and hopes align in a shared rhythm of renewal. When dawn returns, both you and the polis will awaken clearer, ready once more to choose, to learn, and to speak. Every democracy depends on those who have not yet voted. The future voter, the student, the worker, the child watching adults argue on screens, is the next custodian of the collective voice. The choices they will make, years from now, are being shaped silently today by education, by technology, and by the examples they see. If democracy is a living organism, then its future lies in the minds still forming their first opinions. Sociologists define political socialization as the process by which individuals learn civic norms, values, and behaviors. It begins early, through family conversations, classroom discussions, and community experiences. A child who sees respectful debate at home internalizes dialogue as normal. One who sees cynicism learns withdrawal. These early impressions form neural patterns of trust and skepticism. Neuroscience supports this. Pathways related to empathy and fairness develop strongly during adolescence and are reinforced by exposure to cooperative environments. When young people participate in group decisions, their brains learn the emotional reward of fairness itself. Modern research confirms that civic participation correlates with early engagement. When teenagers discuss political issues, volunteer, or attend public meetings, they are far more likely to vote as adults. Participation is habit-forming. Psychologists describe this as path dependency. Once a behavior enters routine memory, it persists. Democracies thrive when they create opportunities for these first experiences: mock elections, youth parliaments, debates, and community service. Each act teaches both competence and belonging. Technology now amplifies the reach of this early influence. Young people encounter politics first through digital media, often before formal education addresses it. Algorithms expose them to movements, controversies, and misinformation alike. The internet functions as both teacher and trickster, offering knowledge without wisdom. The task for modern democracies is to help the future voter develop digital literacy early, to question sources, detect manipulation, and cultivate patience before judgment. In this sense, critical thinking becomes a civic vaccine. Generational psychology adds another layer. Every age group interprets freedom differently. Those raised during scarcity value security. Those born into abundance seek identity and purpose. Studies show that younger citizens tend to prioritize global issues, climate, equality, technology, ethics, while older generations focus on stability and tradition. These differences are not divisions but dynamics. Like ecological diversity, generational variety prevents stagnation. The exchange between old and young refreshes democracy's genetic code, preserving adaptability. Empathy across generations matters profoundly. When elders dismiss youth as naive or youth view elders as obsolete, civic dialogue fractures. But when experience meets imagination, societies gain perspective. Anthropologists have long noted that cultures with strong intergenerational dialogue maintain stability through transition. In modern democracies, mentorship and inclusive policymaking serve that ancient function, bridging the energy of youth with the wisdom of age. The science of motivation reveals why young people engage differently. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. These three elements, identified by psychologist Edward Deci, drive sustained effort. For the future voter, participation must feel consequential, not symbolic. When governments include youth councils or participatory budgeting, motivation deepens because agency becomes tangible. Neuroscientific studies show increased dopamine activity when individuals perceive control over outcomes. Empowerment literally feels rewarding. Yet fear of irrelevance still shadows many young citizens. Economic insecurity, climate anxiety, and social polarization can foster detachment. Why vote, some ask, if nothing changes? The answer, both practical and psychological, is participation itself. Involvement generates efficacy, the sense that action matters. Like exercise strengthening muscle, engagement builds the very power it seems to lack. Across history, generational renewal has saved democracy from decay. Each era's youth redefines freedom in its own vocabulary. The Enlightenment had its philosophers, the 20th century, its activists, today's digital generation, its coders, environmentalists, and data ethicists. Their challenges are new, but their questions are ancient. What is justice? What kind of world will we leave behind? Education systems that nurture curiosity rather than conformity give these questions room to grow. Teachers who encourage uncertainty plant the seeds of self-reliance. When the next generation learns that doubt is not weakness but wisdom, they inherit democracy not as tradition but as experiment, open-ended, adaptable, and alive. The future voter is not waiting to be born. They are already learning what fairness feels like, what truth sounds like, and how power responds to voice. Their understanding of democracy begins in every small moment of inclusion, in every respectful conversation they witness, in every promise adults keep. Someday, when they stand before the ballot box, calm, thoughtful, and informed, they will be the continuation of every mind that ever believed freedom was worth the effort. Democracy's endurance depends on that continuity, an unbroken chain of awareness stretching from the first council fires to the glowing screens of the next century. And in that chain, the future voter holds the final link, not as heir to the past, but as author of what comes next. As night deepens, and the quiet around you grows heavier, the idea of equality begins to feel less like politics and more like breathing, something every living being deserves in rhythm and balance. If your eyes feel tired now, if your thoughts begin to drift like clouds over still water, that is completely fine. The mind, like a society, restores itself through rest. And in that rest, equality finds its most natural form, a calm state where all parts share the same stillness, none louder, none forgotten. In sleep, the body practices what democracy preaches. Each cell receives equal access to oxygen and nutrients, No organ dominates the rest. Balance sustains life. In the same way, the health of a nation depends on equal access to education, justice, and opportunity. When one part of the whole is deprived, the entire organism weakens. Neuroscientists describe a similar principle within the brain. During deep sleep, energy redistributes evenly across regions, allowing repair and integration. The brain does not favor its intellect over its emotion, its logic over its memory. It restores all in harmony. Equality in society works through that same quiet symmetry. Political theorists speak of distributive justice, economists of resource equilibrium, sociologists of social cohesion, all variations of one truth. Fairness is a form of order. Systems remain stable when no group bears perpetual strain. Too much pressure in one region, poverty, exclusion, neglect, causes rupture elsewhere. Democracies that understand this treat equality not as charity, but as maintenance. When people sleep, their differences blur. The scientist, the farmer, the leader, the child, all surrender to the same cycles of breath and restoration. For a few hours, hierarchies dissolve. In that shared vulnerability, the body remembers its humanity. Equality, at its deepest level, is not a political construct but a biological fact. The same electrochemical patterns pulse through every resting mind. The same rhythms of heart and breath unite us across time and place. Historians note that the world's great movements toward justice often began in moments of collective exhaustion. When inequality grows unbearable, societies instinctively seek equilibrium. Revolutions, reforms, and rights movements are all forms of awakening after restless sleep, abrupt corrections to restore balance. But once fairness expands, rest becomes possible again. Calm returns when justice has been served. Today's societies still pursue that balance, applying science to ethics. Data tracks income gaps, education access, and health outcomes with precision. Economists model equality using coefficients and curves. Psychologists measure its emotional effects on trust and happiness. Across every discipline, one conclusion repeats: equality benefits everyone, not only those lifted by it. In more equal societies, stress hormones fall, empathy rises, and crime declines. Even the privileged live longer when fairness prevails. Equality, then, is not redistribution. It is synchronization. In sleep, this synchronization happens automatically. In democracy, it must be chosen. Citizens agree, again and again, to share responsibility for balance. Taxes, laws, and welfare are not burdens but the body's mechanisms for circulation. Fairness keeps the system breathing. When these flows slow or clog, unrest signals the need for renewal, much like a restless night signals the need for deeper rest. Philosophy gives this balance moral language. The Enlightenment spoke of liberty, equality, fraternity, three notes forming one chord. Liberty without equality creates hierarchy. Equality without liberty creates uniformity. Fraternity, the sense of mutual belonging, harmonizes the two. In moments of rest, personal or political, this harmony becomes visible. Freedom, softened by compassion, structure held by understanding. As you breathe now, imagine society breathing with you. Each inhalation draws in trust. Each exhalation releases fear. Somewhere, others rest under the same sky. Strangers, yet part of the same collective rhythm. Their quiet mirrors yours. This, too, is equality. Shared participation in the stillness that renews life. Tomorrow, the world will wake and resume its debates, its ambitions, its complexities. But tonight, the dream belongs to fairness, to a vision of humanity resting without hierarchy, healed by balance, equal in the silence of sleep. And when dawn comes, both mind and society will rise refreshed, ready to begin the long, patient work of justice once more. If democracy provides the heartbeat of freedom, law is its skeleton, the structure that gives that heartbeat direction and endurance. Without legal architecture, liberty collapses into chaos. With too much rigidity, it suffocates. The science of law, though ancient, remains a living discipline, balancing precision with empathy, order with evolution. Every society, whether small tribe or vast republic, has used law to answer one enduring question: how can many act as one without losing the self? Anthropologists find the earliest evidence of law in oral traditions, not written codes, but remembered stories that defined boundaries and expectations. These myths carried instruction disguised as narrative. Tales of betrayal warned against deceit, and parables of justice shaped the sense of fairness long before courts existed. Over time, these oral norms hardened into codes, carved on stone or inked on scrolls. The Code of Hammurabi, the Roman 12 Tables, and the early Islamic Sharia shared a common goal: to convert morality into measurable rule. In modern democracies, law operates as a complex feedback system between principle and practice. Constitutions articulate ideals. Legislatures translate them into statutes. Courts interpret and adjust them over time. The process resembles an evolutionary algorithm: rules tested by real life, corrected through experience, refined through precedent. In this sense, legal systems are empirical. They learn. A bad law, once exposed through its consequences, is repealed or amended. Progress emerges not from perfection, but from correction. Legal scholars often describe the rule of law as a form of social gravity, invisible yet constant. It pulls equally on rulers and citizens, anchoring both to accountability. Without it, societies drift toward arbitrary power, where outcomes depend on favor or fear. But gravity also requires mass, the collective belief that law matters. When citizens cease to trust courts or suspect selective enforcement, the pull weakens. Justice becomes perception rather than principle. The architecture of law depends on three scientific qualities: clarity, consistency, and adaptability. Clarity ensures accessibility, that ordinary citizens can understand their rights. Consistency provides predictability, the bedrock of trust. Adaptability allows law to evolve with circumstance, absorbing new knowledge from fields such as genetics, artificial intelligence, and environmental science. These qualities mirror the design of robust systems in engineering: simple enough to function, flexible enough to survive disruption. The judicial branch acts as democracy's sensory cortex, interpreting signals, distinguishing noise from meaning. Judges weigh not only written text, but context, precedent, and moral consequence. In neurological terms, their deliberations resemble cognitive integration, blending emotion and logic into reasoned decision. Neuroscientists studying moral judgment observe that empathy and fairness share overlapping neural networks. Law, at its best, formalizes these instinctive responses into universal rules. It converts compassion into structure, yet law must also guard against its own rigidity. When statutes ossify, they fail to reflect society's growth. History is full of such fractures, when old laws, built for vanished worlds, constrained new realities. Segregation, censorship, and inequality persisted for centuries because law lagged behind conscience. The scientific analogy is clear: a theory untested by new evidence becomes superstition. Democracies survive by keeping their legal systems experimental, willing to revise hypotheses, to welcome reform without erasing foundation. Technology now tests that adaptability more than ever. Artificial intelligence raises questions about accountability, data ownership, and the meaning of identity itself. Climate science forces legal systems to expand the concept of responsibility beyond generations. International law stretches to cover cyberspace and biotechnology. Each innovation becomes a new architectural wing in the structure of justice, requiring engineers fluent not only in statutes, but in science and ethics alike. Transparency in law mirrors transparency in nature. Sunlight reveals flaws so they can be repaired. Public trials, published rulings, and open data ensure that the architecture remains visible to those it serves. The image of a courthouse, open doors, steps leading upward, is not aesthetic coincidence but civic symbolism. Law must invite approach. Justice must be reachable. When laws function as intended, citizens experience something rare and steady: peace without fear. It is not silence, but confidence, the awareness that disputes can be resolved through reason rather than violence. Psychologists describe this as legal trust, a state where compliance arises from belief, not coercion. It is the quiet triumph of civilization, the transformation of instinct into principle. The architecture of law will never be finished. Like a living organism, it requires maintenance, adaptation, and renewal. But its endurance proves that order and freedom need not oppose each other. Structure can serve compassion, reason can shelter conscience. And when citizens walk beneath that structure, in courthouses, parliaments, or simple town halls, they step into one of humanity's most remarkable inventions, a framework built from words, yet strong enough to hold the weight of justice itself. Across the modern world, the language of democracy speaks most clearly through the vocabulary of rights. These are the shared coordinates of humanity, concepts that transcend culture, religion, and geography, uniting diverse societies under a single principle, that dignity is not granted by power, but inherent to being human. Yet, like all languages, the grammar of rights evolves. It is shaped by history, discovery, and debate, a global conversation still unfolding. The idea of rights is older than the word itself. Ancient codes protected life and property. Religious texts spoke of compassion and justice. But the modern conception, that every person, regardless of birth, holds equal moral worth, crystallized during the Enlightenment. Philosophers such as Locke and Rousseau described these rights as natural, existing before any government. The American Declaration of Independence and the French Declaration of the Rights of Man turned that philosophy into law. Still, these early charters were partial. They excluded women, enslaved people, and the poor. The conversation had begun, but many voices remained unheard. It took centuries, revolutions, and immense suffering for the concept to expand. The abolition of slavery in the 19th century redefined freedom as universal. The suffragist movements of the 20th century extended equality to gender. After the devastation of World War II, the world attempted something unprecedented, a shared declaration for all of humanity. In 1948, representatives from nations across continents signed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a document blending law, philosophy, and science into one moral framework. Its first article reads simply, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights." That sentence carries measurable implications. Neuroscience confirms that humans share nearly identical emotional and cognitive architecture. Biology refutes any claim to inherent superiority. Anthropology reveals that every culture, however distinct, develops moral codes, emphasizing fairness and empathy. The science of evolution itself supports the concept of rights. Cooperative societies survive better than oppressive ones. Equality is not only ethical, it is adaptive. Still, the conversation of rights remains dynamic, expanding as our understanding deepens. The 20th century introduced social and economic rights, access to education, healthcare, and fair labor. The 21st adds environmental and digital rights, the right to clean air, to privacy online, to control one's own data. Each generation redefines what dignity requires in its context. Political theorists call this process normative evolution, values adapting to new conditions while retaining moral continuity. International institutions attempt to codify these expanding norms. The United Nations, the European Court of Human Rights, and regional tribunals form an interconnected web of accountability. Their work mirrors scientific collaboration, peer review on a planetary scale. Cases, like experiments, set precedents. Interpretations evolve through consensus. Progress is slow, but cumulative. Where once rights applied only within borders, they now increasingly transcend them. The global mind learns to think ethically at scale, yet enforcement remains fragile. The same globalization that connects people also enables repression. Authoritarian regimes manipulate information, corporations exploit loopholes, and powerful nations selectively apply the principles they profess. Technology introduces new dilemmas. Who owns the data of the human mind? Can artificial intelligence possess rights or only responsibilities? As with all science, the frontier of ethics moves faster than regulation. Education and empathy sustain progress. When children learn about rights early, not as abstract ideals but as everyday expectations, they grow into citizens who recognize injustice instinctively. Social psychologists find that moral awareness increases when people encounter narratives of suffering and resilience. Stories, films, and art personalize the abstract, embedding human rights in emotional memory. The conversation continues not only in courts and parliaments, but in classrooms, songs, and screens. The global dimension also enriches democracy itself. No nation exists in isolation. Ideas migrate, inspiring reform across borders. South Africa's post-apartheid constitution drew from both Western and African traditions of community. Scandinavian welfare models influenced global labor standards. Even protest movements now share strategies across continents, using digital networks to synchronize change. The global conversation of rights thus becomes a distributed intellect, a planetary exchange of moral discovery. Skeptics argue that universal rights impose one culture's values on another. But cultural diversity does not contradict universality, it interprets it. Just as languages differ yet all describe the same physical world, societies express dignity through their own traditions. The universality of rights lies not in uniform practice but in shared recognition, the understanding that every person, everywhere, has value beyond utility. When viewed from above, humanity resembles a neural network, each nation a node transmitting experience. Some signals falter, others strengthen, but the pattern moves toward coherence. The conversation of rights, though unfinished, is humanity thinking aloud, refining its ethics through trial, empathy, and courage. And perhaps that is democracy's truest expression. Not the vote or the speech alone, but the ongoing willingness to listen across boundaries. As long as this dialogue continues, from village councils to global summits, the idea of universal dignity remains alive, pulsing quietly at the heart of our collective evolution. Every living system adapts to survive, and democracy is no exception. It changes through awareness, a self-correcting process of reflection, feedback, and renewal. Unlike empires that expand through conquest or ideologies that harden into dogma, democracy evolves through consciousness. By noticing its flaws, acknowledging them, and choosing to grow, it is the only form of government that depends on continuous learning. Biologists describe evolution as adaptation guided by variation and selection. In society, the same mechanism unfolds through ideas. New policies, technologies, and moral insights act as genetic mutations. Debate and experience select which endure. Over time, effective principles, accountability, equality, transparency, replicate across cultures. Ineffective or unjust systems fade. Political scientists have mapped this evolution statistically. Despite periodic setbacks, the number of democracies has grown steadily over the past 2 centuries. The curve is not smooth, but the trajectory remains upward, echoing nature's law of incremental improvement. The consciousness of democracy expands as its participants do. Each new discovery in science, psychology, or communication reshapes governance. The printing press birthed literacy and public debate. The Enlightenment infused politics with reason. The digital revolution democratized information itself. Now, artificial intelligence, climate awareness, and neuroscience are redefining what it means to lead, to cooperate, and to belong. These are not external influences. They are part of democracy's internal evolution, the nervous system of the world growing more aware of itself. Philosophers have long predicted this trajectory. Thinkers such as John Stuart Mill, Teilhard de Chardin, and Norbert Wiener imagined societies evolving toward higher integration, individual freedom aligned with collective intelligence. Today, data science and network theory lend their ideas empirical support. Humanity's knowledge doubles faster than ever before, and connectivity weaves our species into what some researchers call a global brain. The challenge is to ensure that this new consciousness remains ethical, that empathy evolves alongside computation. At its core, Democracy's consciousness arises from participation. Each citizen functions like a neuron, processing information and transmitting decisions. When communication is open and trust intact, the network generates wisdom greater than any single mind could contain. But when misinformation disrupts connections or apathy silences voices, the system loses coherence. Cognitive scientists would call this desynchronization, the loss of harmony among neural signals. The health of democracy, like that of the brain, depends on synchronized diversity, many perspectives moving toward shared understanding. Education, transparency, and empathy are the mechanisms of synchronization. They align attention, regulate emotion, and allow collective reasoning. In this way, civic institutions resemble neural pathways, refined through repetition. Elections, courts, and free media form the synaptic circuits through which awareness travels. The process is slow, but every generation strengthens the pattern. Democracy learns by doing, by experimenting, failing, and remembering. The next phase of its evolution may lie in merging moral insight with technology. Artificial intelligence can process data too vast for human comprehension, yet it lacks conscience. Philosophers and engineers are now collaborating to encode ethical reasoning into algorithms, a step toward conscious governance. Environmental sciences urge democracies to expand their moral horizon, to include ecosystems and future generations, introducing what some call intergenerational democracy. Neuroscience, meanwhile, deepens our understanding of bias, enabling policies that counter prejudice at its biological root. All these developments represent the same movement, awareness expanding its field. Critics often describe democracy as inefficient, but its inefficiency is deliberate, a safeguard that prevents rash mutation. Debate slows impulse, consensus filters error. Nature itself favors such moderation. Evolution succeeds through countless small corrections, not sudden leaps. The consciousness of democracy operates on the same rhythm, adjusting through dialogue instead of decree. Its progress is measured not in speed but in stability. Every era introduces new ethical frontiers. The right to privacy in a world of data, the right to a stable climate, the dignity of non-human life. These questions stretch democracy's awareness further. It must learn to think beyond human lifespan and national borders, to include the planet and its future inhabitants in its circle of concern. Political theorists describe this as the moral expansion of the demos, the widening of empathy until it becomes planetary. If history is a record of what humanity has done, democracy is a record of what it has learned. Its survival depends not on perfection but on perception, on the willingness to observe, to admit error, and to begin again. This self-awareness is what makes it both fragile and immortal. As you imagine the centuries ahead, picture democracy not as a building but as a living consciousness, breathing, sensing, and thinking through billions of minds. Its evolution mirrors your own. Awareness expanding, fear quieting, understanding deepening. And in that widening awareness lies its future, not dictated by rulers, but chosen by all who remain awake enough to keep learning. As night finally deepens and thoughts grow slow and weightless, democracy, too, enters its quiet reflection, the resting phase of humanity's collective mind. What began long ago beside the first fire has become a global conversation, still unfinished, still learning. And just as your own mind begins to release the day, the world releases its noise for a moment, gathering strength for what tomorrow will ask. If you are still awake, that is completely fine. Understanding and sleep follow the same rhythm. Both arrive when the mind feels safe enough to let go. In the resting state, the human brain continues to work softly in the background. Memories are integrated, emotions settle, fragments of experience align into understanding. The same thing happens to civilizations. Between the great movements of reform and the storms of history, there are pauses where humanity quietly processes what it has learned. Laws cool, economies stabilize, empathy reawakens. These are the breaths between progress, the intervals that allow meaning to take shape. Biologists call this homeostasis, the condition of dynamic balance. It is what keeps life alive, the self-correcting dialogue between change and continuity. Democracy, too, depends on that dialogue. It needs periods of wakeful passion followed by moments of rest, when people listen more than they speak, reflect more than they demand. These pauses are not empty. They are the dreaming of the world, silent laboratories where justice and memory rearrange themselves for the next awakening. When people sleep, their differences fade. The worker, the scientist, the leader, and the child share the same stillness, breathing the same air. For a few hours, humanity returns to equality, a single rhythm of rest beneath one sky. The idea of democracy, stripped of institutions and flags, is simply that rhythm extended into waking life, a collective agreement that every life matters equally in the great exchange of existence. If you listen carefully to the quiet around you, it resembles the calm that follows deep understanding. The machinery of cities slows, lights dim across continents, billions of minds drift into restoration. Somewhere, a lone researcher finishes a study on cooperation. Elsewhere, a teacher prepares a lesson on freedom. Together, they form the faint hum of progress, steady and patient. Civilization never fully sleeps. It dreams through its people. In those dreams live all that democracy aspires to: balance, curiosity, kindness, and courage. Each generation awakens with slightly clearer vision, inheriting not perfection, but the tools to improve it. The slow refinement of humanity continues, through science, through empathy, through the quiet decision to keep learning even when the world feels weary. That is the truest form of faith. Belief in the capacity of reason and compassion to meet again after every darkness. So now, as your own awareness drifts toward that soft horizon between thought and sleep, imagine the world resting with you. Imagine the oceans exhaling, the cities quieting, the hearts of billions slowing into the same peaceful rhythm. The work of freedom continues even now, invisibly, neurons repairing, ideas combining, trust rebuilding. Tomorrow it will rise again, as it always has, renewed by the patience of night. You are part of that renewal. Every breath you take, every calm reflection, contributes to the collective equilibrium that keeps humanity humane. Rest is not withdrawal from democracy, it is participation in its endurance. For democracies are not sustained by noise, but by the wisdom that follows silence. Sleep, then, belongs to both the individual and the world, a shared restoration, and when dawn returns, both will awaken a little stronger, ready to question, to reason, and to hope once more. We from Sleepy Stories wish you a good night.